He had exactly $20 left in the world. Not $20 until payday. Not $20 in his wallet while more sat in the bank. $20. Total. And somewhere between the fluorescent lights of a gas station and the sound of rain hammering the parking lot, Ryan Holloway made a decision that should have broken him completely, but didn't. He gave it away. To a stranger. Without hesitation. Without asking for anything back. What happened next would take 11,000 families from the edge of ruin, expose a conspiracy buried inside a billion-dollar company, and change two lives forever. This is that story. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came down hard enough that evening to make the whole world feel like it was leaking. Ryan Holloway sat in his car outside the Gulf Station on Route 9 for almost 4 minutes before he got out. Not because he was thinking about anything deep or philosophical. He was just staring at the dashboard, trying to calculate whether $20 of gas was smarter than $20 of groceries. And the math kept coming back the same ugly way, no matter how he ran it. He couldn't afford both. He could barely afford one. The layoff notice was still sitting on the passenger seat, folded into thirds the way the HR woman at the warehouse had handed it to him. Crisp, professional. Like she'd done it so many times, the paper remembered the shape on its own. Effective immediately. Restructuring. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. He'd read it 3 times in the parking lot before driving away. Not because he didn't understand it the first time, but because some part of him kept expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. Ryan was 32 years old, and he had $20, a 7-year-old Ford with a slow leak in the back left tire, and an 8-year-old daughter at home with Mrs. Petrakis from next door, who had agreed to stay until 6:30. It was 6:14. He got out of the car. The gas station was the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and synthetic pine, with lottery scratch tickets fanned out behind the counter and a TV mounted in the corner playing a weather segment nobody was watching. 2 customers ahead of him in line, a construction worker buying a 12-pack and a teenager buying energy drinks with the specific urgency of someone who had somewhere to be that their parents didn't know about. Ryan grabbed nothing. He wasn't there to browse. He walked straight to the register line and stood behind the teenager, his hands in his jacket pockets, his jacket damp at the shoulders from the sprint from the car. That's when he noticed her. She was at the far end of the counter, near the display of phone accessories and travel-sized toiletries, and she was trying very hard not to be noticed. Late 20s, maybe 30, dressed well, dark coat, small leather bag that probably cost more than Ryan's monthly car payment, but her face was doing something that expensive clothes couldn't fix. That particular combination of panic and embarrassment that happens when something goes wrong in public and you haven't figured out how to look like it isn't. She had a phone charger and a small bottle of water on the counter in front of her. The cashier, a heavy-set guy named Dale, according to his name tag, was looking at her with the flat patience of someone who had seen this situation before and wasn't particularly moved by it. "It's saying declined again," Dale said. "I know." Her voice was quiet, controlled. "Can you try it one more time? I tried it twice." "I have another card." She was already pulling it out, fingers moving faster than they needed to, and Ryan watched her jaw tighten slightly when her fingers fumbled the card case. This one should work. It didn't. Dale swiped it, waited, shook his head. The construction worker behind Ryan muttered something impatient. The woman's shoulders came up half an inch, that involuntary flinch when you know people are watching and there's nothing you can do about it. Ryan looked at the items on the counter. A phone charger. A bottle of water. $11, maybe $12. Things a person bought when their phone was dead and they were thirsty. Not luxury items, not extras. The kind of things you needed when you were stuck somewhere and things had already gone sideways. He stepped out of line before he'd finished deciding. "Here." He set a 20 on the counter without looking at her directly, because he knew that looking at her directly would make it worse. He said it the way you'd say, "Here's the salt." Matter of fact, no ceremony. "Keep the change." For a moment, nobody moved. Dale looked at the 20, then at Ryan, then back at the woman. The construction worker stopped muttering. "I can't," she started. "You're fine," Ryan said. He was already stepping back toward the end of the line. "Don't worry about it." He didn't look at her face. He didn't want to see whatever expression was there, didn't want the gratitude or the pity or the surprise. He just wanted the transaction to be done, to get his gas. except now he had no money for gas, and to get home to Emma before Mrs. Petrakis started sending passive-aggressive texts. Dale took the 20. The woman stood at the counter another second, bag in hand, like she was trying to find the right thing to say and coming up empty. Then she picked up her charger and her water and walked out. Ryan got back in line. "What can I get you?" Dale asked when Ryan reached the register. Ryan looked at the counter. He had nothing left in his pockets. Not a card with anything on it, not a crumpled 5, not loose change that added up to anything. "Nothing," he said. "I'm good." He walked back out into the rain. The drive home took 11 minutes, and Ryan spent most of it calculating. The heating oil tank was at a quarter. Emma's winter coat from last year was going to be too small by November. He'd noticed that last week when she tried it on and her wrist stuck out. His phone bill was due in 4 days, and the autopay was linked to an account he'd already quietly moved funds out of. None of these were new problems. They'd been accumulating the way problems did when you were just barely keeping things level, slowly, steadily, one at a time, until you looked up one day and realized the pile had become a mountain. He pulled into the parking lot of the apartment complex on Millwood Avenue just after 6:25 and sat in the car for a moment, hands still on the wheel. Through the second-floor window, he could see the blue-gray flicker of the TV. Emma would be watching something. She watched a lot of TV when he was late, and she never complained about it. And the fact that she never complained about it was one of the things that kept him up some nights. Mrs. Petrakis met him at the door with her coat already on. "She ate the last of the pasta," Mrs. Petrakis said, by way of greeting. She was 71, originally from Athens, and communicated primarily through implication. "I made more." "You didn't have to do that." "Of course I didn't." She picked up her umbrella from the hook by the door. "She asked about her mother today." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "What did she say?" "She asked if her mother would have liked the rain." Mrs. Petrakis looked at him steadily. "I told her yes." "Because what else do you say?" After she left, Ryan stood in the hallway for a moment, still in his damp jacket, listening to the sounds of the apartment, the TV, the rain against the window, the specific quality of silence that existed between those two sounds. "Dad?" Emma's voice from the living room. "Yeah, Bug, I'm here." He found her on the couch with a bowl of pasta balanced on her knees, watching a nature documentary about migratory birds. She was 8 years old and already had her mother's habit of tucking her feet up under her when she sat, and she looked up at him with the easy confidence of a kid who had never seriously doubted that he would come home. That confidence, more than anything, was what kept him functional. "Did you get gas?" she asked. "We're good," he said. She accepted this the way she accepted most of his non-answers, without pushing, with the quiet instinct of a child who understands, on some level she couldn't articulate, that there are questions that are better left soft around the edges. Ryan sat next to her on the couch, still in his jacket, and watched birds fly south over some great gray coast, and didn't say anything about the layoff. He'd figure out how to tell her later. He told her in the morning, or rather he told her as much as an 8-year-old needed to know, which was that his job had ended and he was going to be looking for a new one, and that things would be a little tighter for a while, but they were going to be fine. Emma listened. She was eating cereal, the generic brand, the one with the rooster on the box. And she looked at him with a steadiness that occasionally unnerved him, this focused, unblinking attention that she'd had since she was a toddler, like she was running what you said through some internal algorithm before responding. "How tight?" she said. "We'll manage." "That's not an answer." He almost laughed. "Pretty tight, but not terrible." She ate a spoonful of cereal. "Okay." "Okay?" "Yeah." She shrugged in the effortless way that only children could shrug, like the bones in her shoulders were made of something lighter. "You always figure it out." Ryan looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "I do." He spent the rest of that day at the kitchen table with his laptop and a legal pad, making calls, sending emails, running the numbers on what they could cut and for how long. He had maybe 6 weeks of runway if he was careful. 6 weeks to find something. The problem was that his resume had a gap in it, and the gap was 6 years wide. Before Emma, before everything. There had been another version of Ryan Holloway, one with a downtown office, and a reputation, and a rate card that had made certain senior partners at certain firms visibly uncomfortable. He'd done corporate restructuring work at a level that most people in the industry didn't reach until their 40s. He'd published analysis pieces in journals that got read by the kind of people who made decisions that moved markets. Then Sophie died, and that version of Ryan disappeared like smoke. He didn't leave that world dramatically. He didn't announce anything or write a letter or make a clean break. He just stopped showing up. He picked Emma up from daycare one afternoon. She was 2 years, 4 months old, clutching a finger-painted turkey she'd made, very proud of it. And he took her home, and he made her dinner, and he gave her a bath, and he put her to bed. And somewhere in the middle of reading Goodnight Moon, he decided without ceremony that this was his job now. This was the job. He'd taken small projects since then. Occasional consulting work, nothing that required more than his laptop and a phone call, nothing that required a suit or an office or more than a few hours away from Emma. But the big work, the real work, the kind that required you to be fully present and fully committed, he'd let that go. Now he sat at a kitchen table covered in bills and looked at a resume that described a person who no longer quite existed and tried to figure out how to sell that to someone in the next 6 weeks. His phone buzzed at 11:30. Unknown number, Connecticut area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. But something, maybe desperation, maybe instinct, maybe just the particular restlessness of someone who needed something to happen, made him pick up. Ryan Holloway. A pause. Then a voice he didn't recognize. Composed, professional, careful. Mr. Holloway, my name is Victoria Hayes. I'm sorry to bother you. I think you helped me last night, and I've been trying to find a way to thank you properly. Ryan's first reaction was wariness, not hostility. He wasn't the kind of person who defaulted to hostility, but a specific practical caution. When strangers tracked you down to thank you for something, there was usually a secondary agenda in the room somewhere. You found my number, he said. It wasn't a question. I spoke to the station attendant. He recognized your car from when you've stopped there before. I hope that's not... It's fine. Ryan leaned back in his chair. You didn't have to do this. I know, Victoria said, but I wanted to. You gave away your last $20. I wasn't going to just... I needed to at least say thank you. He went still. How do you know it was my last $20? A brief pause. I didn't exactly. But the way you walked back out without buying anything, and She stopped. I work with numbers professionally. It was a reasonable inference. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Outside, Emma was somewhere at school, probably in math class, which she was inexplicably good at for reasons he liked to think were genetic. Okay, he said. Thank you for calling. I appreciate it. I'd like to repay you. That's not necessary. $20 and a cup of coffee. If you're willing. Her voice was careful, not pushy. There was a quality to it, a kind of practiced control, the voice of someone who spent their days in rooms where every word had weight. I'm in Hartford. I could come to you if that's easier. Ryan looked at his laptop screen, at the blank document that was supposed to become a cover letter. Ms. Hayes, what do you do? I run a financial services firm, Hayes Capital Management. He knew the name. Anyone who'd spent time in Connecticut's finance world knew Hayes Capital. Regional heavyweight, pension fund management, around $7 billion under management at last count. Victoria Hayes had taken over from her father roughly 3 years ago and had, by most accounts, done it well. You had a declined card, Ryan said. I had a stolen card, she corrected, and for the first time there was something underneath the professional composure, a dry, self-deprecating edge. My wallet was pickpocketed at a conference earlier in the day. I only discovered it when I stopped for, well, you know the rest. He did. Coffee, he said. 1 cup. They met the next afternoon at a diner on Farmington Avenue. Ryan's suggestion, neutral ground, the kind of place with laminate menus and competent hash browns that didn't require either of them to pretend they were somewhere else. Victoria Hayes was not what he expected, which was, in hindsight, arrogant of him, to have had expectations at all, based on nothing but an expensive coat glimpsed under fluorescent lighting. She was about his height, dark hair pulled back in the practical way of someone who wore it down on their own time, and she had the kind of eyes that held eye contact without making it feel like a contest. She looked like a person who was used to being underestimated and had quietly made peace with that as a strategic advantage. She was already seated when he arrived, coffee in hand, and she stood when he came in. Not ostentatiously, just the instinct of someone with actual manners. Thank you for coming, she said. Thanks for the invitation. They sat. The waitress came. Ryan ordered coffee and a piece of pie because he'd eaten only toast that morning, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, and Victoria ordered nothing additional, and for a moment they just existed in the low-level noise of the diner. Silverware, conversation at other tables, a country song leaking from the kitchen. "I looked you up," Victoria said. Ryan set down his coffee cup. "Did you?" Ryan Holloway, corporate restructuring specialist, published in the Journal of Corporate Finance and two others I won't pretend I didn't have to look up. Former senior consultant to, among others, a pension fund restructuring in 2015 that I'm reasonably certain saved about 4,000 jobs. She paused. "You went quiet about 6 years ago." "I did." "Personal reasons?" "Yes." She accepted that. Didn't push. He noticed that, the specific discipline of not pushing, and recalibrated his assessment of her upward slightly. "My daughter," he said after a moment. Not because she'd asked, but because withholding information as a matter of principle wasn't something he was interested in. "Her mother died. Emma needed one of us to be fully present, and I was the one who was left." Victoria looked at him across the table, not with pity. He was alert for pity, had been for 6 years, had developed a finely tuned sensor for it, but with something more like recognition. The look of someone who understood that some decisions were made in a moment and lived with for years. "She's 8 now?" Victoria said. 8 in November. He paused. 9. "I can never do that math on the fly." Victoria smiled. It was a small smile, slightly crooked, the kind that happened because it couldn't be helped rather than because it was intended. "I'm not here just to thank you," she said. "I know." "You know, Ms. Hayes." Ryan folded his hands around his coffee cup. "You run a $7 billion fund management firm. You tracked down a stranger at a gas station, looked up his professional history, and invited him to a diner with a $20 bill as the pretext. Whatever you want to say, you can just say it." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table between them. She didn't open it yet. "My company is under attack," she said, "and I have about 3 weeks to stop it before it becomes irreversible." The folder contained 40 pages. Ryan sat in the diner for 2 hours reading it, while Victoria drank a second coffee and answered questions, and mostly stayed out of the way, which was, he was beginning to understand, one of her better qualities. She knew when to talk and when to let someone think. The picture that emerged from the documents was ugly in the precise, bloodless way of financial crimes. There was no dramatic villain with a cape. There was a consortium, an investment group called Meridian Strategic Partners, that had been quietly acquiring voting blocks in Hayes Capital through a combination of direct share purchases and proxy agreements with smaller shareholders. They were currently at 28%. At 35%, they would have enough leverage to call a special shareholder meeting. At a special shareholder meeting, their stated objective was to force the liquidation and redistribution of Hayes Capital's largest managed asset, a retirement fund that held the savings of over 11,000 retirees across 3 states. Teachers, municipal workers, healthcare employees, people who had paid into a system for 30 years and were counting on it to work. Meridian's plan, thinly disguised in language about portfolio optimization and liquidity restructuring, was simple. Break the fund apart, harvest the management fees and transaction costs from the forced redistribution, and leave the retirees to reassemble their savings in a market that was not presently being kind to anyone. "How long have you known about this?" Ryan asked. "Seriously understood it?" "About 6 weeks." Victoria turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. There were signs before that. Unusual trading patterns, some proxy solicitations that seemed disconnected. "My father used to say that when a shark is circling, you usually see the fin before you see the teeth." Ryan looked up. "Your father? He founded the company?" "He did." "Robert Hayes." Her voice changed slightly on the name, not breaking, not sentimental. Just a flicker of something careful. "He passed away 8 months ago. I'm sorry. He was sick for a while. We knew it was coming." She paused. "He kept working until 3 weeks before the end. He was—" She stopped. "He was a very stubborn man." Ryan looked back down at the documents. Something had caught his attention, a date in the margin of one of the proxy solicitations. His pen moved without quite thinking about it, circling the date, drawing a line to a second date 2 pages earlier. "Meridian accelerated their acquisition timeline," he said. "Right after your father died." Victoria's eyes sharpened. What? Here. He turned this folder toward her, pointing. They'd been moving slowly for months, patient, careful, below the reporting threshold each time. Then, in the 30-day window after your father's death, they made 4 separate block purchases. Total acquisition in that month was almost as much as the previous 8 months combined. Victoria stared at the pages. They knew he was sick, Ryan said. Everyone knew he was sick. No, they knew the timing. They knew that his death would create a succession window, a period of internal distraction, and they positioned to move through it. He looked at her. Has anyone in your executive team been in contact with Meridian's principals? She was very still. We don't know, she said. That's part of what we don't know. Ryan closed the folder. He looked at the table for a moment, then out the window at Farmington Avenue, at the rain-darkened street and the passing cars and the particular gray ordinariness of a Connecticut afternoon. He thought about Emma, about the way she'd said you always figure it out over her bowl of cereal that morning, about the layoff notice still sitting on the passenger seat of his car. Then he thought about 11,000 people who had worked their whole lives and done everything right and were about to lose a significant piece of what they'd built because a group of very organized people with spreadsheets had decided the money was more useful to them than to its actual owners. What do you need? He asked. Victoria looked at him steadily. I need someone who can design a defense structure that permanently removes the retirement fund from Meridian's reach. Someone who understands the legal architecture, the financial mechanics, and the board dynamics well enough to make it work under time pressure and with a potential security leak somewhere in the organization. She paused. I've talked to 4 other consultants. None of them could give me a credible plan in the time we have. The leak, Ryan said. What's your evidence? Information has moved too fast. Twice in the last month, Meridian's lawyers have filed motions that could only have been informed by internal documents that hadn't been shared outside the company. Who has access to those documents? 12 people, all of them on the executive committee. Ryan was quiet for a moment. I have a daughter, he said. I know. I can't do this if it requires me to disappear into an office for 3 weeks and miss everything that makes her life work. Victoria leaned forward slightly. You set your own terms, hours, location, whatever you need. I'm not asking you to rebuild a career. I'm asking you to solve a specific problem that I believe you're capable of solving. What are you offering? She named a number. Ryan didn't let anything show on his face, but the number was real. The kind of real that meant Emma's winter coat and the heating oil and the phone bill and 4 months of runway after that. I'll need to see everything, he said. Board minutes, correspondence, the full acquisition trail on Meridian's positions, and I want a complete org chart of your executive team with every external relationship flagged. I can have that ready by tomorrow morning. One more thing. Ryan looked at her. The people in that retirement fund, the 11,000, do any of them know what's happening to their money right now? Victoria's expression shifted, something behind her eyes that she didn't quite let reach her face. No, she said quietly. Ryan nodded. Then we need to be fast, he said. He told Emma that evening that he had some consulting work that had come up. Is it good work? Emma asked. She was doing homework at the kitchen table, long division, which she found irritating in the specific way that smart kids found things that required patience rather than insight. It might be. Good money? Ryan looked at her over his own laptop. Where did you learn to ask about money? Emma shrugged. Mrs. Petrakis. She says always ask about money first before you get attached to something. Ryan considered this. Mrs. Petrakis is not wrong. Is it? Yeah, Bug, it's good money. Emma went back to her long division. Cool. That was the whole conversation. He worked until 2 in the morning, the apartment quiet around him, Emma asleep down the hall. He'd already started mapping the problem in the legal pad he used when he needed to think in analog. Columns, connections, question marks where the gaps were. The legal architecture of a protective trust wasn't complicated in theory. The complications were all about speed, secrecy, and getting enough board members to act before Meridian's people could respond. And somewhere in the executive committee was a person who was feeding information to the other side. That person was the variable that made everything else harder, because anything Ryan designed, anything Victoria approved, anything that moved through the company's internal communications, all of it was potentially visible to Meridian within hours. He needed to work around that. He made a note on the legal pad. Assume everything internal is compromised, designed for that. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. No explanation, just an address, and my father's personal files are there. I found something tonight. I think you should see it. He stared at the text for a moment. Then he typed back, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Her response was immediate. I'll be there. Ryan closed his laptop. He went to the doorway of Emma's room and stood there for a moment in the dark, the way he'd done every night since she was an infant. Not checking on her exactly, just locating her, making sure she was real, making sure the world still contained her. She was breathing slowly, one arm thrown over her head, her hair spread out across the pillow in the undisciplined way of kids who'd fallen asleep mid-motion. He stood there for about 30 seconds. Then he went to bed. The address Victoria had sent was a storage facility in East Hartford, a climate-controlled unit rented under her father's name, apparently untouched since his death. They met outside at 9 in the morning in weather that couldn't decide between fog and drizzle and had settled unhappily on both. Victoria was there before him, in a dark coat, holding 2 coffees from the place across the street. I found out about this unit 2 weeks ago, she said, handing him one of the cups. His assistant mentioned it when we were going through his estate. I kept putting off coming here. Grief has its own schedule, Ryan said. She glanced at him sideways, not quite looking at him directly. Yes, it does. The unit was small and neat in the way of someone who organized his thinking spatially. Banker's boxes, labeled and dated. A locked file cabinet along one wall. Several binders on a metal shelf, each with a year written on the spine in black marker. Victoria went straight to a box near the back that she'd clearly already opened. She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Ryan. He opened it. Inside were 6 printed pages, research notes, handwritten annotations, and at the bottom, a business card. His business card. Old from years ago. His name, his old office number, his firm's address. And across the back in Robert Hayes' handwriting, call this man if anything happens. He'll understand what to do. Ryan stood in the storage unit holding his own business card and felt something settle oddly in his chest. Not warmth, exactly. More like the strange disorientation of discovering you have a role in a story that you didn't know you were part of. How did he know me? Ryan asked. I've been trying to figure that out. Victoria pointed to the research notes. Those are from about 18 months ago. He was already tracking Meridian. He saw them building position long before anyone else did. He was looking for someone with the right expertise to help him design a defense. Why didn't he call me then? He started to. His assistant found a draft email in a folder labeled unsent. He wrote it, and then didn't send it. Victoria paused. I think he was trying to solve it himself first. He didn't like asking for help. Ryan looked at the business card in his hand, this small, slightly yellowed rectangle that had somehow outlasted the career it described, and traveled from some conference or some professional directory into a dead man's files and then into this moment. Your father was a careful man, Ryan said. Very. The notes here, he'd already identified the leak. He knew there was someone inside the company feeding information. Ryan looked up at her. He just didn't name them. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. I know. He's written confirm before acting at the bottom 3 times. She pointed to the margin. He didn't want to destroy someone's career on suspicion. That's admirable, Ryan said. Also inconvenient. Both things are true. Ryan looked at the binder on the shelf from 2 years ago. Can I take these? Take whatever you need. He carried 3 boxes to his car in 2 trips, Victoria helping with the second. Standing in the fog outside the storage facility, neither of them spoke for a moment. A truck went by on the road. Someone's phone rang in the distance and went unanswered. Your father left me a job, Ryan said. It was a strange thing to say, and he knew it, but there wasn't a less strange way to put it. Victoria looked at him. He had good instincts about people. Ryan put the boxes in his car. I'll start on the structural framework tonight, he said. The trust design, the board vote sequence, the timeline. But I need you to help me think about the executive committee. What do you need? I need you to tell me about each of them. Not professionally, personally. Who they are, how they think, what they want. He paused. And I need you to do it somewhere that isn't your office. Victoria nodded slowly. My apartment. Fine. Tonight? No. I need to make my daughter dinner. He said it simply, without apology. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Victoria looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. 7 o'clock, she said. He made Emma chicken pasta that evening, the good kind, with the sauce from scratch, which he only did when he felt guilty about something or needed to think. "This is the thinking pasta," Emma announced at the table. "What?" "You make it when you're thinking about something," Mrs. Petrakis says. Ryan stared at her. "Mrs. Petrakis needs a new hobby." Emma ate a forkful. "What are you thinking about?" Ryan looked at his daughter across the table, her mother's eyes, his own tendency to hold things carefully before speaking. This particular combination that had produced a person he hadn't expected and was still sometimes astonished by. "I'm thinking about some people who might get hurt if nobody does anything," he said, "and whether I'm the right person to do something." Emma considered this. "Are you the only one who can?" "I might be."
Then there's no thinking about it. She ate more pasta. "If you're the only one, you have to. It's more complicated than, Dad." She looked at him with the patient, slightly exasperated expression that she'd inherited from no one he could identify and had probably just developed independently. "You're making complicated pasta. It's not that complicated." Ryan was quiet for a moment.
Then he laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere in the chest and surprised him with its own sincerity. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, you're right." Emma went back to eating, satisfied. Ryan sat with his plate going slightly cold and thought about 11,000 people he'd never met and one dead man's handwriting on the back of a business card, and felt, for the first time in several days, like he knew exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Victoria's apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in Hartford's South End that had once been a textile warehouse and still carried that history in its bones. Exposed brick, high ceilings, windows that were almost aggressively large. Like whoever converted the building had felt guilty about all those years of blocking out the light. Ryan arrived at 6:58 with his legal pad, his laptop bag, and the 3 boxes from the storage unit, 2 of which he'd already gone through twice. Emma was with Mrs. Petrakis, who had been informed there was a work meeting and had responded by arriving 12 minutes early with a container of her own pastry, and the unspoken implication that Ryan was not as capable of managing his schedule as he believed. Victoria opened the door before he knocked. She was in a different register than the diner version of herself. No coat, no professional armor, just dark slacks and a gray sweater, her hair down. She looked like a person who lived in the apartment instead of someone performing living in an apartment, which struck him as a meaningful distinction. "You found parking," she said. "3rd floor of the garage. It cost $8, and I'm billing it." Something in her expression loosened slightly. "Come in." The apartment was spare in a way that suggested choice rather than indifference. A few good pieces of furniture, a lot of books arranged without any decorative pretension, spines out, some of them sideways, some with slips of paper marking pages. A whiteboard on one wall covered in handwriting that hadn't been erased. A framed photograph on the shelf that Ryan didn't look at directly, but caught the periphery of a man with gray at his temples and Victoria's same jaw, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. She had set up the dining table with printouts, a carafe of coffee, and a second legal pad. "You work like your father," Ryan said. Victoria glanced at the table. "People keep telling me that." She didn't say whether it bothered her. "Sit wherever." Ryan sat with his back to the window. Old habit. He liked seeing the room. He opened his legal pad to the page he'd started that morning, where he'd mapped the 12 members of the executive committee in a rough grid with notes beside each name. Victoria sat across from him and leaned slightly forward to see it. "Walk me through them," Ryan said. "Not titles. People." Victoria poured coffee into both cups and settled back in her chair. She had, he noticed, a particular way of going still before she spoke about something that required precision, a kind of gathering, like a person checking inventory before opening a door. "Marcus Webb," she said, "Chief Investment Officer. He's been at the company 22 years, started under my father. Smart, careful, deeply risk-averse. He's the most likely person to go to ground if he smells a problem. Not from guilt, from self-preservation. He doesn't do well with uncertainty. Relationship with your father? Complicated. My father respected his technical ability and found his personality exhausting. Marcus knew it. He spent 15 years trying to earn something my father was never really going to give him." Ryan wrote, "Webb, loyal-ish, emotionally dependent on validation, possible vulnerability." Next, Patricia Donnell, Chief Legal Officer. 12 years at the firm, 3 before that at a white shoe firm in New York that she left under circumstances that were never publicly explained. My father trusted her completely. I trust her about 70%. What's the other 30? She has a relationship with one of Meridian's outside counsel that predates both her time at Hayes and Meridian's formation. They were at the same law firm in the 90s. I don't know how much they still communicate. Ryan looked up. That's not nothing. I know, but it's not evidence either. Victoria held her coffee cup without drinking from it. She's helped build every legal defense we've put in place so far. If she were the leak, some of those defenses would have failed in ways they haven't. Ryan wrote, Donald, possible conflict, pre-existing relationship with outside counsel. Watch, but don't assume. They went through the remaining 10 over the next 90 minutes. Some of them were easy. Clear loyalties, clear limitations, nothing that set off Ryan's internal alarm. Others were murkier. A CFO named Gerald Park, who had taken 2 unexplained days off during the week, Meridian filed its first proxy motion. A newly appointed board member named Sandra Crow, who had previously served on the board of a company that Meridian had dissolved 3 years earlier and had never, to anyone's knowledge, mentioned this. It was Sandra Crow's name that made Victoria go quiet for a long moment. I appointed her, Victoria said. Who recommended her? Gerald. A pause. Gerald recommended her. Ryan set down his pen. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Victoria stood up and walked to the window. She stood there with her back to him, looking at the city below. The rain-wet streets, the scatter of lights, Hartford doing what Hartford did in October, which was mostly endure. My father would have caught that, she said. It wasn't self-pity. It was the flat, functional anger of someone who had made an error and needed to look at it directly before they could move past it. Your father had 20 more years of experience than you do, Ryan said, and he still didn't catch Meridian until they were already a significant way through their play. Victoria turned from the window. That's generous. It's accurate. He looked at her steadily. You want to sit with this for a while, or you want to keep working? She came back to the table. Keep working, she said. So they kept working. By 10:30, Ryan had filled 6 pages of his legal pad and had narrowed his suspicion to 2 names, Gerald Park and Sandra Crow, with Patricia Donnell as a distant but non-zero third. He'd also roughed out the skeleton of a defense strategy that he needed to stress test overnight, but which he was beginning to believe could work. The core of it was disarmingly simple in concept and extraordinarily complicated in execution. Transfer the retirement fund's assets into an independent statutory trust before Meridian could call the special shareholder meeting. A trust structured correctly would place the assets outside the reach of any corporate action, protected by a legal framework that would take years and multiple court challenges to unwind. And by the time Meridian could mount that challenge, the political and regulatory attention generated by the attempt would make it more trouble than it was worth. The problem, Ryan said, spreading out the legal pad page where he'd sketched the trust structure, is that this requires a board vote. Simple majority, but still a vote, and the vote has to happen before Meridian reaches 35%. How long do we have? He'd done the math twice. Based on their current acquisition rate, 11 days, possibly 12. Victoria was quiet for a moment. 11 days. 11 days to get 6 board members to agree to a structural change that will feel, to at least some of them, like it limits their own future flexibility. Ryan leaned back in his chair. And you have to do this without letting the people who might vote against it know what's coming until it's too late for them to tip off Meridian. So I need to run a board campaign in secret, inside your own company, with at least one person in the executive committee actively working against you. Ryan looked at her. It's doable, but we need to be right about who the leak is before we design around them. Victoria's hands were flat on the table, very still. We could be wrong. We could be. If we assume it's Gerald and Sandra and we're wrong about one of them, the whole strategy is compromised. Yes, she looked at him. So how do we find out for certain? Ryan had been thinking about this for 3 days, running different approaches, and they all came back to the same uncomfortable answer. We feed them something false, he said. A piece of information that's specific enough to seem credible, different enough for each of them, that if it surfaces at Meridian, we can trace it back to its source. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then, you're talking about lying to my executive team. I'm talking about a controlled information test. That's a nicer way of saying the same thing. Yes, Ryan said simply. It is. She looked at the window. The rain had come back. Quieter now, a steady low hiss against the glass. Victoria had the kind of face that was hard to read, not because it was blank, but because the expressions moved through it quickly, processed and set aside, like someone sorting mail. If this works, she said, and it comes out later, and these things always come out, the person I feed the false information to will know what I did. The person you fed the false information to will also have been actively helping destroy the retirement savings of 11,000 people, Ryan said. I'm not sure the moral math is as complicated as it feels right now. The moral math is always more complicated than it feels. She said it without heat, just as a statement of fact. But you're right. She looked at him. Design it. Tell me what each of them needs to hear, and I'll deliver it. Ryan started writing. They worked until almost midnight. At some point, Victoria made toast, the small domestic act happening in the background while Ryan was 3 pages deep in the trust documentation framework, and she set a plate down next to his legal pad without comment, and he ate it without looking up. And it wasn't until he was driving home that he registered how natural that had felt and filed it, with mild wariness, somewhere in the back of his mind. He called in to check on Emma when he got to his car, Mrs. Petrakis answered, which meant Emma was asleep. She's fine, Mrs. Petrakis said. She asked me why you were working at night, and I told her important work happens at night. She said that sounded correct. Thank you, Ryan said. You should eat more, Mrs. Petrakis said, and hung up. He drove home through wet streets and thought about trust structures and false information and a dead man's handwriting on a business card, and tried to keep those thoughts away from the more private compartment where he'd put the observation about how natural it had felt to eat toast in Victoria Hayes's kitchen at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. He mostly succeeded. The next 5 days were the hardest kind of busy. Not frantic, but relentlessly dense, the kind of work schedule where you're always one step ahead of the last thing you didn't finish. Ryan worked from his kitchen table from 6 in the morning until he had to stop to take Emma to school, then from 8:30 until 3, then picked her up, made dinner, put her to bed, and worked again from 9 until whatever time his brain stopped processing in useful ways. He had drafted the full trust structure by the end of day 2. It was 73 pages of documentation, operating agreement, asset schedule, governance framework, independent trustee nomination process, and he'd used an outside legal research service to pressure test the structure against 15 different attack vectors, all of which the trust survived. He sent it to Victoria in sections, encrypted, through a communication channel they'd set up specifically for this project, and which neither of them accessed through company servers. Victoria's feedback was quick and precise. She made 11 suggested changes. 9 of them were good. 2 of them were wrong, and he told her so. And she said, explain it rather than accepting or pushing back. And he explained it, and she said, okay. You're right, without any indication that being wrong bothered her more than it needed to. He was starting to understand why Robert Hayes had built something with her. The information test was delivered on day 3. Ryan had designed 3 distinct pieces of false information, plausible enough to seem real, different enough from each other to be traceable. Victoria delivered them personally, in separate one-on-one conversations that were framed as confidential strategy discussions, to Gerald Park, Sandra Crow, and a third candidate Ryan had added late, a board member named Holt Delaney, who showed up in 2 of Robert Hayes's old notes in contexts that bothered Ryan when he read them carefully. Then they waited. Waiting was Ryan's least favorite part of anything. He was not by nature patient. He was disciplined, which wasn't the same thing. Discipline let you control your behavior. It didn't make the waiting feel less like pressure building in a sealed container. He kept himself occupied by finalizing the board approach. They needed 6 votes. Victoria was certain of 3. Herself, Marcus Webb, who had, on balance, come down on the side of loyalty over self-preservation when Ryan's assessment of him was tested against his actual behavior in 2 recent board disputes, and a retired actuary named Helen Cho, who had been on the Hayes Capital Board since Robert's original founding, and who Victoria described as the most morally unambiguous person I have ever met. She'll vote for what's right, Victoria said, when Ryan asked about her. She always has. Does she trust you? Victoria paused. She trusted my father. She's still deciding about me. Then you need to talk to her before the meeting. Not about the vote. Just talk to her. Victoria was quiet on the phone for a moment. That's not really how I know, Ryan said. Do it anyway. Another short silence. You're not wrong. I know. He heard something that might have been a reluctant exhale. I'll call her tomorrow. The call Ryan was actually waiting for came on day 4 at 11:40 in the morning. He was standing at his kitchen counter eating a sandwich he'd made with more care than it deserved, turkey, the good mustard, actual bread, when his phone rang with Victoria's number. It was Gerald, she said. Ryan set down the sandwich. You're sure? The piece I gave him was a number. A specific internal valuation figure for one of the fund's largest positions, slightly wrong in a very particular way. This morning, Meridian's legal team filed a motion referencing market intelligence that would only make sense if they believed that figure was accurate. Her voice was controlled, but underneath the control there was something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. The specific feeling of having suspected something and then been proven right, and discovering that being right felt awful. It was Gerald. Ryan closed his eyes for 1 second. 22 years. He'd been with the company 22 years. Okay, he said. Don't do anything yet. Don't confront him. Don't change his access. Don't let anything in his environment change. I know. She'd already thought through this. He could tell from the speed of her answer. If he knows we know, he'll warn them and they'll accelerate. We need 4 more days, Ryan said. Just 4 more days and then it won't matter what he tells them. 4 days, Victoria said. It wasn't agreement so much as calculation, running the same timeline in her own head. The board meeting is in 5 days. I know. Can we be ready in 4? Ryan looked at his legal pad. The timeline, the sequence, the vote projection, all of it mapped out across 6 pages. He'd been over it so many times he could have reproduced it from memory. There were 2 variables he couldn't fully control, and 3 assumptions he was making that were probably right, but not certainly right. Yes, he said. We can be ready. He went back to work and didn't eat the rest of the sandwich. Victoria called Helen Cho that afternoon. She didn't tell Ryan how it went until 2 days later, when she mentioned, with the careful casualness of someone trying to sound like something didn't matter when it did, that Helen had said she reminded her of her father in some ways, and not just the stubborn ones. That's a good sign, Ryan said. I know. A pause. It was a strange conversation. She talked about him like he was still in the room. Ryan thought about business cards and storage units and handwritten notes, and the strange persistence of the dead in the lives they'd organized. People who build things, he said, tend to stay in them. Victoria didn't answer that, but she didn't change the subject either, and after a moment the silence between them settled into something that wasn't uncomfortable, just the sound of 2 people thinking about the same thing from different angles. The final 3 days before the board meeting were a controlled escalation of pressure that Ryan would not have admitted at the time was affecting him. The work was nearly complete. The trust documentation was finalized, reviewed, and ready to execute. The board approach was mapped. They had, at Ryan's last count, 5 solid votes and 1 probable. A hedge fund manager named Tim Brower, who had been on the board for 18 months, and whose public statements suggested he valued long-term stability over short-term yield, but who was also by nature a person who waited to see which way the room was moving before committing. Tim Brower was the 6th vote they needed. On the day before the board meeting, Ryan drove to Hartford and sat in Victoria's office for the first time. He'd avoided it until then deliberately. He hadn't wanted to exist in the company's physical space while Gerald Park was still inside it, moving around with his access intact and his guilt undetected. But there were logistics that needed to be handled in person, documents that needed signatures, a sequence of actions that had to happen in a specific order over the next 18 hours. Gerald Park passed Ryan in the hallway outside Victoria's office at 2:15 in the afternoon. Ryan didn't know what Gerald knew, or suspected, or felt. The man was 50-ish, compact, with a careful face that revealed very little, the face of someone who had spent a long time in environments where revealing too much was a liability. He glanced at Ryan with the neutral curiosity of someone encountering an unfamiliar person in a familiar space, and Ryan glanced back with the same neutrality, and they passed each other in the corridor like 2 people with nothing to say to each other, which was the most accurate possible description of the situation. In Victoria's office, with the door closed, Ryan spread the final version of the board materials across her conference table. Brower, he said. Victoria sat down and looked at the materials. I talked to him this morning. And? He asked me 2 questions. First, is the trust structure reversible if the strategic environment changes? She looked up. I told him no. Good answer. Ryan said. Second, does the existing board retain oversight of trustee appointments? She paused. I told him yes, with specific limitations I outlined from your framework. His response? He said he'd think about it. She looked at Ryan, which from Tim Brower means yes. Ryan exhaled slowly. He hadn't been aware he'd been holding anything back, but the exhale was long enough to suggest otherwise. Then we have the votes, he said. Victoria looked at the materials on the table. 73 pages of architecture and defense, the product of 11 days of work done under time pressure with a security leak in the building, built in an apartment kitchen and a car and a living room at midnight while an 8-year-old slept down the hall. We have the votes, she said. She said it quietly, like she was checking whether the words were true before she allowed herself to believe them, and Ryan recognized that. Had felt it himself, the particular caution of a person who has been careful for so long that hope feels like a thing you have to test before you commit your weight to it. One more day, he said. One more day, Victoria agreed. She looked at him across the conference table with the afternoon light coming through the large windows behind her, and Ryan looked back and neither of them said anything for a moment. There was no particular reason for the silence except that some moments needed a second before they moved on, and this seemed like one of them. Then Ryan's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Petrakis. Emma is asking if you remembered about the school project. I told her I would inform you. I am informing you. He looked at the text. I have to go, he said. Victoria's expression shifted into something brief and genuine. School project? Apparently. He was already putting on his jacket. What's the project? She raised an eyebrow. I have no idea, but I'd move fast. Ryan left. He made it to Emma's school in 22 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than normal, and not something he was proud of. Emma was at the aftercare table with a look that communicated without words that she had been expecting him to forget, and had not actually been surprised when he did. The solar system, she said. Right. We need the styrofoam balls. I know. Dad, you don't know. I don't know, he agreed. Where do we get them? They went to the craft store and Ryan spent 40 minutes helping Emma pick the right sizes of styrofoam balls for the planets, and arguing, not very seriously, about whether Pluto counted. Emma's position, which she held with the conviction of someone who had done research, was that Pluto counted, and anyone who said otherwise was not engaging with the full complexity of the situation. Ryan painted Neptune badly and Jupiter worse, and Emma repainted both without commenting on his effort. And they ate dinner at the kitchen table with planet-colored fingers and something simple Ryan had thrown together from what was in the fridge: eggs, leftover rice, the end of a bag of frozen vegetables. And it tasted better than it had any right to. Emma held up a blue styrofoam ball the size of a baseball. Earth, she announced. It's a little lopsided. Earth is a little lopsided, Emma said, with complete seriousness. Ryan looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, her face concentrated and paint-streaked and entirely at peace with the universe, and felt the specific gratitude that had no clean expression, the kind that lived in the chest rather than the throat, that didn't need to be spoken to be complete. Tomorrow, there would be a board meeting, and 11,000 strangers' futures would hinge on a vote, and somewhere in a downtown Hartford office building, a man was sitting with his guilt and his access card and his 22 years of institutional knowledge and no idea that the window he'd been feeding information through was about to close. But tonight, there was a solar system on the kitchen table and a daughter who was currently explaining to him, with great patience, why Saturn's rings were, technically, more important than Saturn itself. Ryan listened. He asked questions. He was present in the way that mattered, the only way that ever actually mattered, which was completely. The board meeting was at 9 in the morning. He went to bed at 11, and for the first time in 11 days, he fell asleep before his brain had finished its last circuit of the problem. Ryan woke up at 5:47, 13 minutes before his alarm. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling in the dark, running the sequence in his head the way he'd done every morning for the past week. Not anxiously, just the way a pilot runs pre-flight checks, methodical and necessary. Trust documentation, executed and filed the previous afternoon with an independent trustee nominee already in place. Board materials, distributed to the 5 confirmed votes through a secure channel that bypassed company servers. Vote sequence, mapped and rehearsed, with contingency positions for 3 different scenarios. Gerald Park, Still in place, still unaware, his access intact and carefully unaltered for exactly 9 more hours. Everything was where it was supposed to be, which meant the anxiety he felt was not about preparation. It was about the part that no amount of preparation could fully cover. The part where humans were involved, where votes were cast by people rather than algorithms, where the best plan in the world met the unpredictable territory of a room full of individuals with their own fears and loyalties and private calculations. He got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. The street below was still dark, the streetlights making orange halos in the early morning dampness. A delivery truck went by. A woman walked a large dog with the resigned energy of someone who hadn't wanted to get up either. Ryan poured his coffee and went to check on Emma. She was asleep on her back with one arm off the side of the bed, her hand dangling, completely relaxed in the way that children slept before the world taught them to carry tension even in rest. The solar system project was done, sitting on her desk in 8 pieces. Planets and sun arranged in order, each one painted and labeled in Emma's handwriting, which was neat in the careful way of someone who'd been told her whole life that her handwriting was hard to read and had decided, at some point, to prove that wrong. Ryan stood in the doorway for about 20 seconds. Then he went back to the kitchen and ate toast and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. And by 6:30 he had showered, dressed, and was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the board materials one final time for no good reason other than that he needed to do something with his hands. His phone buzzed at 6:45. Victoria, you're up. He looked at the message. Since 6, same. Did you sleep? Some. You?
A pause of about 4 seconds. Not really. I keep running the Brower scenario. Ryan set down his coffee cup. He typed, Brower is a yes. He told you as much. He said he'd think about it, which you said means yes. It does. I've seen that language from his type before. He's already decided. He just wants the record to show he was deliberate. Another short pause. Then, what if I'm wrong about Webb?
Ryan looked at that message for a moment. Marcus Webb, 22 years, complicated relationship with Robert Hayes, deeply risk-averse, emotionally dependent on validation he'd never quite received. Ryan had assessed him as a reluctant ally, loyalty winning out over self-interest, but only barely. He still believed that, but he understood why Victoria was circling it at 6:45 in the morning. You're not wrong about Webb, he typed. He's going to be uncomfortable. He's going to look around the room before he commits. Let him. Don't read his hesitation as opposition. And if it is opposition, then we still have Brower and we still pass. But it won't be. He waited. Okay, she wrote. Eat something before you go in, he added. Not because it was a strategic insight, but because it was true and he suspected she hadn't. The response took a moment. That's not in the plan. It should be. Another pause. There's a diner on Trumbull. I know it. Go. He could almost feel the reluctant concession moving through the phone. Fine. 7:30. Come if you want. He looked at the time. He had 2 hours before he needed to be anywhere. I'll be there at 7:15, he typed. He got there at 7:12. Victoria was already at a table near the window, which meant she'd arrived before 7:15 while technically agreeing to 7:30. And he noted this as consistent with everything he'd come to understand about how she operated, always slightly further along in the plan than she let on. She was eating eggs. This pleased him more than it probably should have. You ate, he said, sitting down. I ordered eggs. I'm getting there. She pushed the coffee carafe toward him. How are you feeling? It wasn't quite a question, more an opening, the kind that gave him room to answer any number of ways. Ready, he said, nervous in the way that's useful. She looked at him. Is there a kind of nervous that's useful? The kind that keeps you paying attention. He poured his coffee. The other kind is the kind that makes you second-guess decisions that don't need to be second-guessed anymore. I've been experiencing that second kind for approximately 6 hours. I know. You texted me about Brower at 6:45. Victoria picked up her fork. I text people at 6:45 normally. Do you? She held his gaze for a moment. No. The diner was filling up with the early morning Hartford crowd. Construction workers, a couple of nurses in scrubs, a man in a suit reading something on his phone, with the focused urgency of someone whose morning had already gone wrong in ways they were trying to fix remotely. The ordinary machinery of people starting their days, none of them aware that two people at a window table were 3 hours from attempting to permanently remove $7 billion in retirement assets from the reach of a group of people who had spent the better part of a year trying to get their hands on it. Ryan ordered toast and a second coffee and watched Victoria eat and thought about the boardroom and the votes and Gerald Park, who was probably, right now, getting dressed in whatever house he went home to, getting ready for a board meeting he believed was going to be unremarkable, unaware that the ground he was standing on had been removed from under him. After today, Victoria said, when this is done, whatever direction it goes, she stopped, set down her fork, started again more carefully. I want to be clear that whatever happens in that room, I'm grateful for the work, for the... She seemed to look for the word, for the way you approached this. Ryan looked at her across the table. Let's get through the room first, he said. I know. She picked up her fork again. My father had a thing, he said, about delayed gratitude. He said the problem with saving it for after is that after doesn't always look the way you expected. Ryan thought about that, about Robert Hayes and a storage unit's worth of files, about handwritten notes and unsent emails, and the particular sadness of someone who had seen a problem coming and run out of time to fully address it. He was right, Ryan said, but we're going to be fine. He said it without the excessive confidence that would have made it a performance, and without the hedging that would have made it meaningless. Just as a statement, the way you said the road's clear when you'd actually checked. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and something in her posture, very slightly, settled. They finished breakfast and didn't talk much more. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they'd been working together long enough that silence between them had stopped being a gap and become something more like a shared space where thinking happened. The Hayes Capital offices occupied the top 4 floors of a building on Constitution Plaza, all glass and steel, and the architectural confidence of money made before the 2008 humility. The lobby had Robert Hayes' name on the founding plaque near the elevators. Ryan read it as he passed, the name in raised bronze letters, and thought about a business card in a manila envelope, and felt the specific weight of the morning settle more firmly across his shoulders. Victoria had arranged for him to be listed as an external security consultant, a category that gave him building access and board meeting attendance without triggering whatever monitoring Gerald Park or Sandra Crow might have on personnel movements. He'd been in the building 3 times before, always entered through the garage, always avoided the main elevator bank. Today, he walked through the lobby with Victoria and took the elevator to the 18th floor. The board meeting was in the main conference room, a room that Ryan had seen in photographs but not in person. Long table, 18 chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the river. The kind of room where the furniture communicated that the decisions made at this table were expected to have consequences. Board members arrived between 8:45 and 8:58. Ryan knew all of them by file and photograph, but photographs were always approximate. They captured the surface and left the actual person to be discovered in motion. Helen Cho was smaller than he expected, in her mid-70s, with white hair and the measured gaze of someone who had been in enough rooms like this one to have stopped being impressed by them. She arrived first, nodded at Victoria, with a particular quality of acknowledgement. Not warm exactly, but considered. The nod of someone who had decided something and was at peace with the decision. Marcus Webb arrived 3 minutes later and immediately occupied his chair with the tightly contained energy of a man trying not to appear nervous, which was the most reliable indicator Ryan knew of someone who was nervous. He glanced around the room as he sat down. Quick inventory, checking the attendance, noting the presence of someone he didn't know, and when his eyes landed on Ryan, they held there for half a second longer than a glance at a stranger typically would. He was going to be exactly the way Ryan had predicted. The question was whether the room would hold him. Tim Brower arrived at 8:52, speaking quietly on his phone, and ended the call before he reached his chair. He sat down, organized his materials with the efficiency of a man who attended a lot of meetings, and glanced at Victoria with a brief expression that Ryan clocked as, "I've made my decision, and I'm ready to have done with this." That was the 6th vote. Gerald Park arrived last, at 8:58, and sat in his usual chair near the middle of the table. He looked exactly as he had when Ryan had passed him in the corridor. Composed, contained, readable as nothing. A man who had spent 22 years becoming unreadable. Sandra Crow had called in sick that morning. Victoria had told Ryan this at 7:55, and Ryan had been unsurprised, whether it was genuine illness or the anxious avoidance of someone who sensed, on some level they couldn't articulate, that today was not a day they wanted to be present for. Either way, her absence didn't change the math. Victoria called the meeting to order at 9 on the dot. She didn't ease into it. Ryan had advised her on this. Not aggressively, just practically. The more runway she gave the room before reaching the main item, the more time existed for Webb to generate anxiety, for Park to sense something off in the atmosphere, for any of the other variables to compound in unhelpful ways. Get to it directly. Own the room from the first sentence. "I want to go to item 3 first," Victoria said, and something in her voice had shifted from the woman Ryan had sat across from at breakfast. Not colder, just more settled, the way a frequency stabilizes when you stop adjusting the dial. "I know that's out of order. I need the board's full attention before other business fragments it." Gerald Park looked up from his materials. Victoria looked at the table. Not at any single person, at all of them at once. The way you looked at a room when you needed the room to understand that what you were about to say was for everyone equally. "Over the past several weeks," she said, "working with external security and legal consultants, I've developed a proposal to restructure the Hayes Capital Retirement Security Fund into an independent statutory trust. The documentation has been prepared, reviewed for legal soundness, and is ready for a board vote today." She paused. "I want to be direct about why this is urgent and why it's being presented this way. I'll explain, and then I'll open the floor." She explained. She did it in 12 minutes. Ryan had helped her structure the presentation, and she'd added her own voice to it, and the result was something that moved through the necessary information without padding, without defensive hedging, without the kind of excessive qualification that made people feel like they were being managed rather than informed. She explained Meridian's acquisition position, their projected timeline to the 35% threshold, their stated intention regarding the fund, and what that intention meant in practical terms for 11,000 people. She explained the trust structure, what it did, what it protected, what it foreclosed. When she finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms were quiet when people were processing rather than disengaging. Helen Cho spoke first. "The trust governance," she said. "The independent trustee. How is that appointment structured to prevent future capture?" Ryan had written the answer to this question into the operating agreement in 3 different places. Victoria gave it cleanly and correctly, and Helen Cho nodded with the minimal satisfaction of someone who had asked a hard question and received an answer that passed. Tim Brower asked 2 questions about the reversibility provisions and the regulatory filing timeline. Victoria answered both. Brower made a brief note on his pad and sat back. Marcus Webb hadn't spoken. Ryan was watching him from the far end of the table, watching without appearing to watch, which was a skill he'd developed in years of sitting in rooms where the most important thing happening was never at the center of the table. Webb's hands were on his materials. His expression was doing the thing Ryan had expected. That particular internal conflict that looked like careful consideration, but was actually a man trying to decide how much loyalty he felt and whether it was enough. A board member named Philip Kastner, 60, retired banker, reliable institutional vote, asked a question about the tax implications of the transfer that was slightly off base but well-intentioned, and Victoria handled it with more patience than strictly necessary, which was the right call because Kastner wasn't the problem, and making him feel heard cost nothing. Then Gerald Park spoke. "I want to understand the timeline," he said. His voice was even, measured. "You're asking for a vote today, at a meeting that wasn't specifically agendized for this item. That seems accelerated." "It is accelerated," Victoria said, "which raises a question about due diligence. This is a major structural change. The board should have time to review. The board has the documentation." Victoria's tone didn't harden, but it didn't give either. "It was distributed this morning. The time pressure isn't a choice I made. It's the reality of Meridian's acquisition timeline." Park held her gaze for a moment. "Some of us might want legal advice beyond what's been provided here." "Patricia Donnell has reviewed the trust structure," Victoria said. "Her memo is on page 41. A brief pause. Ryan watched Park look down at the documents. He'd seen the memo, of course, but he'd been hoping, Ryan thought, that it wasn't there, that there was a procedural gap he could point to that would create delay. The memo was there. The gap wasn't. "I'd still want more time," Park said. "Gerald?" This was Helen Cho. She'd turned slightly in her chair to look at him directly, with the specific authority of someone who had been in the room since before Gerald Park had arrived and would be there after. The question before us is whether the assets of 11,000 retirees should be protected, not whether we had enough notice, not whether the process was conventional. Those are real concerns in normal circumstances. These aren't normal circumstances. She looked at him steadily. Do you have a substantive objection to the structure itself? Park held her gaze. He was very good at composure. Ryan could see that, the trained steadiness of a man who'd been careful for so long that the carefulness had become involuntary. But there were things the body did that composure couldn't entirely prevent, and Ryan watched the slight tightening around Park's jaw and knew what it meant. He didn't have a substantive objection. He had an interest in delay. No, Park said, finally. No substantive objection. Victoria moved directly to the vote. She called the names in the order Ryan had mapped, starting with the certainties, building the momentum before it reached the people who would need the weight of it. Helen Cho. Yes. Tim Brower. Yes. Philip Kastner. Yes, slightly hesitant, but yes. A board member named Rosa Fitzgerald. Yes, clear and immediate. And then Marcus Webb. The room was very quiet. Webb looked at the table. He had the documents in front of him, Patricia Donnell's memo bookmarked with his thumb, the face of a man who had spent his career measuring risks and was measuring one now that was different from any of the others because it wasn't financial. Ryan watched him and didn't move and thought about nothing except this specific moment, the way you held perfectly still when something delicate was in balance. Webb looked up. He looked at Victoria. Victoria looked back. She didn't encourage him. She didn't plead. She just held his gaze with the steady attention of someone who had earned her position in this room and knew it. Yes, Marcus Webb said. Victoria noted it. She looked at Gerald Park. Park's yes was the quietest word Ryan had heard in a long time. It landed in the room and settled like something that had already died on the way down. He said it because he had no procedural cover left, no credible basis for a no that wouldn't immediately raise the question of why, and the answer to that question was not one he was ready to provide in this room. The vote was 7-0. Sandra Crow absent. Victoria announced the result. She then said with the same even delivery she'd used for the entire meeting, I also want to address something else, and I need the board's attention for this as well. She paused. Over the course of preparing this defense, we identified an internal security breach. Confidential information was provided to Meridian's legal team by someone with executive access. The evidence has been reviewed and documented. The room changed. It was a specific change, the kind that happened when the temperature of a space shifted without any physical cause, when the air rearranged itself around a new fact. Ryan watched the faces. Helen Cho, unsurprised, grim. Brower, attentive, waiting. Kastner, alarmed, mouth slightly open. Gerald Park, very, very still. Based on the evidence gathered, Victoria said, I'm requesting Gerald Park's immediate resignation from his positions at Hayes Capital, effective today, pending a full legal review that will be turned over to the appropriate authorities. Park didn't move for a moment. The room held him in place with the weight of 10 people's attention, and then he did something Ryan hadn't entirely expected. He nodded, a single, small nod, almost imperceptible, like a man acknowledging a verdict he'd known was coming for longer than he'd admitted to himself. I'd like a moment, Park said. Of course, Victoria said. Park gathered his materials and stood, and the room watched him do it without comment, and he walked to the door and opened it and left, and the door closed behind him, and that was that. 22 years ending in the particular silence that followed a man's footsteps down a hall. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Helen Cho said quietly, his family is going to have a hard time of this. It was an odd thing to say in a board meeting, and it was the right thing to say, and Ryan liked Helen Cho considerably more for having said it. Victoria adjourned the meeting at 9:54. Ryan was out in the hall before most of the board members had stood up from their chairs, not because he was in a hurry, but because he needed to breathe air that wasn't the specific pressurized air of that room. He stood at the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the river below, gray-green in the October light, moving at its own pace, completely indifferent to what had just happened on the 18th floor of a building on its bank. He felt... what? He tried to locate it accurately. Not triumph. Not relief exactly, though there was some of that,
Something more like the specific exhaustion that followed a sustained effort, the particular flatness of a person who has been tightly coiled for 11 days and has just been given permission to uncoil. And something else, underneath that, something quieter.
He'd done the work Robert Hayes had wanted someone to do. He hadn't known Robert Hayes. He'd held the man's business card once, briefly, years ago, at some conference or industry event, in the way you held anyone's business card, with the casual acknowledgement of a connection that might or might not amount to anything. And somewhere in the intervening years, Robert Hayes had written his name down in a file and filed it in a storage unit and died before he could use it. And the work had gotten done anyway. Ryan wasn't given to sentiment about these things. He was not the kind of person who looked for larger patterns in ordinary events and found meaning that the events hadn't put there. But standing at that window, he allowed himself to notice the thing without immediately explaining it away. Victoria found him there about 4 minutes later. She stood beside him at the window, not touching, looking out at the same river. She hadn't said anything in the boardroom beyond what the moment required, and she didn't say anything now for a moment, and Ryan let the silence be what it was. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I ran a mile in formal shoes." A pause. "Good. Mostly good. Sad about Gerald in a way I didn't expect to be. 22 years is a long time."
It is. I keep thinking... She stopped. Tried again. I keep thinking my father would have been angry. Not sad. He would have been furious, and he would have expressed it as disappointment, and then he would have moved on. She looked at the river. I don't think I can move on quite that fast. That's not a flaw, Ryan said. It might be in this business. No, it's not. He looked at her. The people who move on from things like this without feeling them are the people you have to watch.
Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was embezzling, not a lot. Patricia found it in the audit trail last night. Small amounts over 4 years routed through a vendor account. That's what Meridian had on him. That's how they turned him." Ryan absorbed that. The specific ugliness of it. Not ideology, not principle, not even ambition. Ordinary fear. A man trying to hide an ordinary venal mistake and being caught by people who collected that kind of thing professionally and stored it for precisely this kind of use. "Have you told Patricia?" he asked. "This morning, before the meeting, she took it badly. She'd trusted him." Victoria paused. "We all had." Ryan looked back in the river. A boat went by, small in the distance, moving steadily downstream. "What happens now?" he asked. Not about Gerald, about everything else, the company, the retirees, the aftermath of a board meeting that had just permanently restructured the thing Robert Hayes had spent his life building. Victoria took a slow breath. Now the independent trustee takes formal control of the fund. Meridian's lawyers get notified. They'll threaten litigation. They've already threatened litigation. But Patricia says the structure is solid enough that a legal challenge would take years and cost them more than the play was worth in the first place. A pause. "Then I have to tell 11,000 people what almost happened to their money. They deserve to know." "I know?" Another pause. "I'm not looking forward to it." "No, but you'll do it well." She looked at him sideways with an expression he'd come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. The one that happened when he said something direct and she was deciding whether to acknowledge it or deflect. She acknowledged it. "Thank you for..." She made a small gesture that encompassed apparently all of it. "All of this." "You hired me," Ryan said. "You were unemployed and gave a stranger your last $20. I'd say the credit distribution is more complicated than that." Ryan almost said something. He stopped himself, looked back at the river, let the almost something stay where it was for now. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out expecting Victoria's assistant or Mrs. Petrakis or a notification of some kind. It was a text from Emma, sent from the school iPad she was only supposed to use for educational purposes. Did the work thing go okay? Ryan looked at the text for a moment. He typed back, "Yeah, bug. It went okay." Her response arrived in 4 seconds. "Good." Mrs. P made pastry. He showed it to Victoria without entirely planning to. She read it and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Something smaller, a fraction of one, the kind that came from something genuinely landing rather than something performed. "She worries about you," Victoria said. "She denies it." "That's how you know it's real." Ryan put his phone back in his pocket. Down the hall, someone had opened the door to the conference room, and the sounds of the building's ordinary workday were filtering back in. Phones, voices, the distant percussion of keyboards and copiers and people going about the business of a Wednesday morning in October. The room they'd just been in was already becoming, in the way of rooms, just a room again. The weight of what had happened in it was dispersing back into the air, redistributed into all the people who carried pieces of it out with them. 11,000 people were going home tonight not knowing that something had nearly happened to their money, and hadn't. They'd make dinner and watch television and go to sleep without knowing that a board vote at 9 in the morning had been the difference between the life they expected and a significantly harder one. Ryan thought about that. He'd thought about it before, at the kitchen table at midnight, during the parts of the work that were repetitive enough to leave room for thinking. He'd thought about the particular nature of protection, how most of the time the people being protected didn't see it happening, didn't know the room existed, didn't know there was a person at a window in a building on Constitution Plaza who had spent 11 days mapping the walls of a container that now held everything they'd saved. It wasn't a complaint. He wasn't looking for acknowledgement from 11,000 strangers. He was just noting it, the invisible architecture of the decisions that held ordinary life in place. He pushed off the window. "I need to pick up my daughter at 3, he said. Victoria looked at him. "That's 4 hours from now." "I know. Is there anything else you need from me today?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that moved through several things before settling on something that was honest without being more than the moment could hold. "Not today," she said. "I think I can manage the rest of it." "Good." He picked up his bag from where he'd left it against the wall. He was almost to the elevator when Victoria called after him. "Ryan!" He turned. She was standing at the window where he'd left her, the river behind her, the gray light making everything in the hallway look slightly more significant than it probably was. She looked for a moment like a person rather than a CEO, tired and relieved and carrying something she hadn't put down yet, and maybe wasn't ready to. "My father's note," she said, "the one on your business card. He'll understand what to do. I've been thinking about what he meant by that. Not the professional part, the other part, the understand part." She held his gaze. "I think he meant someone who knows what actually matters. Not just the structure, the—" She didn't finish. Ryan stood at the elevator. "Tell him thank you," he said, "when you're back at the storage unit." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face. Not grief, not quite, but the near relative of it, the feeling that lived in the same neighborhood. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I will." Ryan pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He stepped in, and the doors closed, and he rode down through 18 floors of a building with his name on nothing, and his work and everything, and walked out through the bronze-plaqued lobby into the gray October air of Hartford. He had 4 hours before Emma's school let out. He went to get coffee and sat in his car for a while and didn't do anything at all, which was, after 11 days, exactly the right thing to do. The weeks after the board meeting had a specific texture that Ryan hadn't anticipated. He'd expected the work to end cleanly. A defined problem, a solution, a handshake, and then the ordinary life he'd been living before Victoria Hayes walked into the frame. That was how consulting projects were supposed to work. You came in, you did the thing, you left, and the company went on without you, and you went on without it, and both parties were fine with that arrangement because the arrangement was honest about what it was. That was not what happened. The trust filing generated immediate legal response from Meridian, as expected. Their lawyers sent a 14-page letter to Patricia Donnell's office within 36 hours of the board vote, citing procedural irregularities in the trust formation and threatening an emergency injunction. Patricia had been ready for this. Ryan had helped her prepare for it specifically, anticipating the exact arguments Meridian's counsel would use and drafting the counterpositions. And the injunction threat died in a preliminary hearing 4 days later when the judge reviewed the trust documentation and found it, in his words, structurally sound and fully compliant. Ryan learned about the hearing outcome from Victoria in a text that said, "Judge dismissed it. Patricia says it's over." And then, after a pause, "It's over." He'd been at the kitchen table when he got that message, watching Emma do homework, and he'd read the text twice and then set his phone down and not picked it up again for an hour. It was over. Except that Meridian, being the kind of organization that had not gotten to where it was by accepting outcomes gracefully, didn't stop at one injunction attempt. Over the following 2 weeks, they filed 2 additional motions, Different angles, creative legal theories that Ryan had to acknowledge were professionally constructed, even while he was helping Patricia dismantle them. The second motion died in 3 days, the third took 5. They're going to keep trying, Patricia told Victoria in a conference call Ryan was on, until the cost benefit stops working in their favor. When does that happen? Victoria asked. It already has, technically, Patricia said. They're spending more in legal fees than the play was worth at this point. They're doing it now out of institutional pride. A pause. That'll run out eventually. Ryan contributed 2 structural notes on the call and otherwise stayed quiet, which was increasingly his mode in the official Hayes Capital interactions. Present, useful when useful, invisible when not. He told Victoria from the beginning that he didn't want a visible role, and she'd honored that, and the result was that most of the company's employees had no idea who he was or what he'd done, which suited him fine. What didn't suit him entirely was how difficult it was turning out to be to actually leave. This was not romantic, or at least he told himself it wasn't primarily romantic, which was different from telling himself it wasn't at all. It was that the work kept generating loose ends, and the loose ends kept requiring his specific knowledge to address, and Victoria kept calling at reasonable hours with specific, legitimate questions. And he kept having answers, and the whole thing had developed a kind of persistent relevance that made clean departure inconvenient. He told himself this honestly and tried to evaluate it without the comfortable distortions that humans applied to situations they wanted to be true. The other honest thing was Emma. Emma had met Victoria for the first time on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the board meeting, and the meeting had happened in the way that things happened when Ryan failed to plan them properly. Victoria had come to drop off the final signed copies of his consulting agreement, a formality, something that could have been handled electronically, but she'd offered to bring personally, and he'd said fine. And Emma had been at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and her science textbook and the particular alertness of a child who noticed everything. Victoria had knocked. Ryan had answered the door. Emma had looked up from her cereal and assessed the situation with her mother's eyes, and her own specific combination of wariness and open-minded interest. "Hi," Emma said. "Hi," Victoria said. Ryan stood between them, holding an envelope of documents, feeling completely useless. "I'm Emma." "Victoria, nice to meet you." Emma looked at her for a moment, then she looked at Ryan, then back at Victoria. "You're the work thing." "I am," Victoria said. There was something in her voice, a genuine amusement, unmistakable, the kind that happened without trying. "The work thing. That's accurate. Dad talks about work without actually saying what the work is. It's a whole thing with him." "Emma," Ryan started. "I'm just telling her." Emma looked at Victoria with the frank assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to make her evaluation subtle. "Do you want coffee? He makes good coffee. He'll make some anyway." Ryan made coffee. Victoria sat at the kitchen table and drank it and answered Emma's questions, which were specific and unsorted by any particular social filter. How does a company work? What does a CEO actually do on a daily basis? Was it weird being the boss of people older than her? Did she have pets? What did she think about Pluto? On the Pluto question, Victoria said carefully that she thought the reclassification was scientifically defensible, but personally, she found it sad. And Emma made a sound of deep vindication and pointed at Ryan. "See," Emma said. "I never said it wasn't sad," Ryan said. "I said it was scientifically accurate." "Both things," Victoria said. Emma looked at her with the expression of someone who had found an unexpected ally on a long-contested front. Ryan stood at the counter with his own coffee and watched this exchange happen and felt something he had no clean vocabulary for. Not alarm exactly, not the protective wariness he'd have expected to feel when someone new entered Emma's orbit. More like watching 2 separate parts of his life negotiate the question of whether they could share the same space, and being surprised that the negotiation was going so naturally. It ran long. Victoria had planned to stay 20 minutes. He could tell from the way she'd arrived with the envelope already in hand, the body language of a person with the next thing. She stayed almost 2 hours, and it was Emma who eventually ended it by announcing that she had homework, and thus the adults needed to wrap up their visiting, which was a formality she'd apparently decided to enforce. At the door, Victoria said quietly, so Emma couldn't hear, "She's remarkable. She's a handful," Ryan said. "Same thing, usually." He looked at her in the doorway. The documents were in his hand. He'd taken them and forgotten about them, which said something. "Coffee again sometime, well," he said. It wasn't a question quite. It wasn't quite a statement either. It was the kind of thing you said when you meant something specific and were being careful about how directly you meant it. Victoria looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Coffee again." She left. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Emma appeared at his elbow. "She's nice," Emma said. "She is." "You could have said so." Ryan looked down at his daughter. "I wasn't not saying it." Emma went back inside. Ryan stood in the doorway another second, looking at nothing in particular, and then he went inside too and made lunch and didn't think about it more than was reasonable, which was a difficult standard to define. The first time Victoria met Mrs. Petrakis was by accident, on a Wednesday evening when Ryan had suggested they work through the final language on a transition document for the Trust's independent governance review. Genuinely work, a table covered in papers, dinner from a Greek place down the street that Emma had requested with the specific authority of someone who understood their own preferences clearly. Mrs. Petrakis arrived to collect a pan she'd left there the previous week and encountered Victoria at the kitchen table and gave her the kind of assessment that was conducted entirely through expression, lasting approximately 4 seconds, and yielded a conclusion that Mrs. Petrakis did not share with either party in the room. She shared it with Ryan the following day, in passing, dropping off something he hadn't asked her to bring. "The woman from the company," she said. "She's a serious person." "She is," Ryan said. Mrs. Petrakis looked at him. "You need serious people. Emma needs serious people." She picked up her empty bag. "This is an observation." "I got that. I'm not advising you." "I understand." Mrs. Petrakis left. Ryan stood in the kitchen and thought that being advised by Mrs. Petrakis while she denied advising him was one of the more consistent experiences of his adult life. The full weight of what had happened at Hayes Capital landed publicly in the third week of November, when Victoria issued a formal statement to the fund's 11,000 beneficiaries. Ryan read the draft before she sent it. She'd asked for his eyes on it, not for structural reasons, but because she wanted, as she put it, someone outside the company's internal echo chamber to tell her whether it was honest. It was. She'd written it herself without legal softening, and it said plainly what had happened, that the fund had been targeted, that the targeting had been defeated, that the assets were now in a structure that protected them from future corporate action, and that as CEO she took personal responsibility for the period during which the threat had developed without her full awareness. "The lawyers are going to hate that last part," Ryan told her. "They already have," Victoria said. "I sent them the draft first." "And?" "Patricia said it was inadvisable, and then said she understood why I was doing it, and asked me not to quote her on that." "Are you going to change it?" "No." He'd looked at the draft on his laptop in the kitchen while Emma was at school, and the last paragraph had sat with him in the way that writing sat with you when it was doing what writing was supposed to do. Not performing honesty, but being honest, the difference being everything. The responses from the beneficiaries came in over the following days. Not to Ryan. He wasn't named in the statement, wasn't named anywhere publicly, which was entirely as he'd arranged it. The responses came to Victoria's office. Emails, letters, some phone calls to the main line. Most of them were brief. People processing relief in the shorthand of people who were not professional communicators. "Thank you. I didn't know. We're grateful." One letter came from a retired teacher in Bridgeport who had written 2 pages in a careful hand about what the fund represented, about 31 years of teaching, about the specific arithmetic of a retirement she'd planned around a number she'd trusted to be there. Victoria sent Ryan a photograph of that letter without comment. He read it twice. Then he put his phone down and went to make coffee and stood at the window the way he'd been doing a lot lately, which was looking at the ordinary middle distance and letting things settle at their own pace. He thought about the night at the gas station. The rain. The declined card. The $20. The math that had seemed, standing in that parking lot with nothing left, very simple and very final. He thought about how the distance between that night and this one was, in elapsed time, barely 6 weeks. In almost every other metric it was not measurable. The transition document for the trust governance was finished on a Tuesday afternoon. Ryan sent it to Patricia, CC'd Victoria, and sat back in his chair and looked at his kitchen ceiling and acknowledged, with the particular reluctance of a person who had gotten comfortable with something, that the work was done. There were no more loose ends with a legitimate claim on his time. There were no more motions pending. Patricia had the legal architecture. The independent trustee had the operational handbook. Victoria had the board. He had done what Robert Hayes had wanted someone to do. He had also, in the process of doing it, accumulated $11,000. The consulting fee, paid in 2 installments, which had solved the immediate crisis of the heating oil and Emma's winter coat and the phone bill, and left a buffer that was not comfortable but was real. He had also, in the process of doing it, been offered something else entirely, which he'd been sitting with for 4 days without responding. Victoria had proposed it in her office, on the Friday before the governance document was finished, in the same direct way she proposed most things. Not as a pitch, not as a negotiation, just as a statement of what she was thinking and an invitation for him to respond honestly. "I want to talk to you about a role," she said. Ryan had been expecting this, or something like it, and had spent the previous week trying to figure out what he actually thought about it, which was complicated by the fact that what he thought was entangled with things that weren't cleanly professional. "You don't have to frame it carefully," he said. "Just say it." Co-CEO, Victoria said, shared leadership structure. You take the restructuring and risk strategy function, the external work, the defense architecture, the analytical side. I stay in the client and governance role. It's not a charity offer, and it's not a thank you gift. The company needs what you do, and you're the right person to do it. Ryan looked at the window behind her. The river was there again, gray and indifferent and moving at its own pace. "I have a daughter," he said. "I know. She's the first thing, not one of the first things. The first thing." "I know that too." Victoria held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to unknow that. I'm asking you to consider whether a role structured around your actual life is something that works for you, not whether the idea of going back to that world is something you can tolerate. Whether this specific thing, designed this specific way, is something you want." Ryan was quiet for a moment. 4 days, he said. "Let me sit with it. Take the weekend," she said. That had been 5 days ago. He was now past the weekend, past the deadline he'd implicitly set for himself, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with Emma across from him eating the remains of dinner and doing homework, and occasionally asking him questions about fractions that he answered on autopilot, while his actual thinking was somewhere in a parallel process he hadn't managed to shut down. "You're doing the face," Emma said. Ryan looked up. "What face?" "The one where you're thinking about something and you're not going to say what it is, but eventually you will." He looked at his daughter. She had a pencil behind one ear and a fraction worksheet in front of her, and the patient expression of someone who had time. "I got offered a job," he said. "The company job? The work thing job?" "Yes." Emma looked at him. "Is it good?" He thought about how to say this. "It's the kind of job I used to do. Before you. Before everything changed." Emma absorbed this. She chewed on the end of her pencil in the way he'd told her 20 times not to. "Would you have to go away?" "No. Same city, same hours I choose." "Then what's the problem?" Ryan looked at his daughter. "The problem," he said, "is that I left that world for a reason, and I'm trying to figure out if going back is—" He paused. "If it means something about what I chose." Emma was quiet for a moment. She was 8 years and some months old, and she had, in Ryan's experience, about a 50-50 hit rate on saying exactly the right thing in moments that adults found complicated, not because she had wisdom beyond her years in the greeting card sense, but because she hadn't yet learned to make things as complicated as adults made them. "You didn't leave because you hated it," she said. "No. You left because of me." "Yes. And I'm here. I'm fine. I have fractions and Mrs. P and the solar system project." She said it with the calm inventory of a person taking stock. "You don't have to keep leaving because of me." Ryan sat with that for a moment. He stopped. "I know it's hard," Emma said, with the specific gentleness of a child who understood she'd just said something that landed harder than she'd intended. "But it's true." He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. Her mother's eyes, her own particular clear-sightedness, this combination that he'd watched develop over 8 years and still wasn't used to encountering in the body of a child. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." Emma went back to her fractions. Ryan sat for another minute, and then he picked up his phone and opened Victoria's number and typed, "I've been thinking." Her response came quickly. "I've noticed. You've been quiet for 5 days." "I'm saying yes," he wrote, "with conditions." A short pause. Then, "Tell me the conditions." He typed them out. 7 of them, specific and non-negotiable. Everything from hours and schedule flexibility to the explicit understanding that Emma's school events were calendar items that did not move for board meetings. He sent them. Victoria's response took 3 minutes. He could almost feel her reading carefully. "Yes to all of it," she wrote. "Everyone." He looked at the message. Then he put the phone down and said, "Hey, Bug." Emma looked up. "I'm taking the job." Emma considered this for a moment with the focused seriousness she applied to important announcements. Then she said, "Cool. Can I have more pasta?" Ryan laughed. It came from the same place it always came from when Emma made him laugh. Not the surface, somewhere deeper. The place that had been there since the beginning and would be there, he suspected, long after he stopped being able to explain why. He got up and made more pasta. The formal announcement was handled quietly within Hayes Capital the following week. A restructured leadership model, Ryan's appointment as co-CEO, a brief internal memo that Victoria wrote herself and that said what it needed to say without performance. Ryan read it and found one word he'd change and didn't suggest changing it because it wasn't that important, and he was learning, gradually, the difference between the things that were his to influence and the things that were hers. That distinction was, he was finding, one of the more important things about working alongside Victoria Hayes. She was not easy. He'd understood this from the diner, from the first hour of professional proximity. Not difficult in the ways that made people hard to work with, but demanding in the way that certain people were demanding when they cared deeply about outcomes and had specific standards for how things should be done. She changed her mind when evidence required it and not in response to social pressure, which Ryan respected. She was occasionally blunt in ways that landed harder than she intended and didn't always notice when they had, which Ryan filed as something to watch. She worked too much. Not in the martyrdom way, just the way of a person who found work genuinely engaging and had to occasionally be reminded that the world still existed outside the building. He was not easy either. He knew that. He was private in ways that could read as withholding. He had opinions he'd formed in the pre-Emma years that he sometimes carried too rigidly and had to consciously examine. He was better at identifying what was wrong than at naming what he wanted, which was a different kind of limitation and one he was slower to acknowledge. They were, in other words, two people with their own histories and their own rough edges, trying to build something functional from adjacent but distinct starting points. The first week of the new arrangement had 2 significant disagreements, one significant misunderstanding about communication style, and one afternoon where they got through 4 hours of genuinely productive work without friction, which felt like an achievement proportionate to everything that had preceded it. On the Friday of the second week, Victoria stopped by the apartment. She'd developed a habit. Not a planned habit, just something that had accumulated from the coffee meetings and the document drops and the working sessions, of sometimes arriving with takeout from somewhere specific and practical, without ceremony, in the way of a person who had learned that feeding people was a workable expression of the things that were harder to say directly. That evening, she arrived with Thai food, and the news that Meridian's third and final legal motion had been formally withdrawn that afternoon. Ryan heard the news while setting out plates and felt the same flat, complete exhaustion he'd felt walking out of the Hartford building 6 weeks ago. The particular settling of a person who had been braced for a long time and could finally stand straight. Emma, who had been doing something with the solar system project, wandered into the kitchen and assessed the situation. The takeout containers, Victoria's coat over the chair, Ryan's expression, with her usual efficiency. "Staying for dinner?" she asked Victoria. "If that's okay," Victoria said. "We have enough," Emma said. She looked at Ryan. "Right?" "We have enough," Ryan said. Emma pulled out 3 plates with the practicality of someone for whom hospitality was a logistical question rather than a social one, and set the table with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything, and that was that. Victoria stayed for dinner. They ate the Thai food, and Emma told them about a project at school involving the water cycle, with a level of detail that suggested she'd found the water cycle personally meaningful in a way that exceeded the curriculum's ambitions for it. Victoria asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than performatively adult, and Emma answered them with the expansive satisfaction of someone whose expertise was being properly engaged. And Ryan sat at the head of his kitchen table and ate his dinner and watched these two people in his life occupy the same space and felt the same thing he'd felt the first morning at the diner, that he was in the right place. Not a perfect place. Not an uncomplicated place. There were things he hadn't resolved and things between him and Victoria that existed in an ambiguous territory neither of them had named. There were things about the new job that would be hard in ways he hadn't fully encountered yet. There were things about raising Emma alone that would stay hard regardless of anything else, but the right place. He was sure of that. After dinner, Emma went to do homework and then went to bed, and Ryan and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with the remains of dinner and the particular quiet of a house in the evening. And it was easy in the way that some things were easy, not because they required no effort, but because the effort felt right size for what they were building. Meridian withdrew it today, Victoria said again, like she was confirming something she was still integrating. I heard. Ryan looked at the table. How do you feel? Like it might actually be done. It is. People keep saying that. A pause. I'll believe it in about 2 weeks when nothing else arrives in Patricia's inbox. Fair enough. He looked at her. Your father would have... He stopped. Victoria looked at him. Would have what? Been satisfied, Ryan said. Not effusively, but satisfied. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She'd been back to the storage unit once since the morning they'd gone together. Alone, she'd told him briefly, and hadn't elaborated, and he hadn't asked. She carried her father the way people carried the people they'd lost, when the loss was too specific and too recent to have found its permanent shape yet. He would have liked you, she said. I think I would have liked him. You would have disagreed with him constantly. Probably. He needed that. She looked at the table. He spent too many years in rooms where people agreed with him before they'd finished thinking. She paused. I didn't do that, but I also only had 3 years working alongside him as an adult. There was a lot we didn't get to. Something moved through her face. I keep thinking about the storage unit, about all those boxes, all those files. Ryan nodded slowly. He was building a record, Victoria said. Everything filed, everything labeled. Not for him. He knew what was in there. For whoever came after. She looked at Ryan. For whoever needed it. He left you well-equipped, Ryan said. He left us well-equipped. She said it quietly, and the U.S. landed where it was supposed to land, in the space where the line between professional and personal had been getting less distinct for several weeks, and neither of them moved to correct it. Ryan looked at the table. The dinner debris. The stack of papers from the day's work at one end. The third plate Emma had set out without being asked, with the matter-of-fact hospitality of a child who had decided, in her own quiet way, that there was room. More coffee, he said. Yes, Victoria said. He got up and made it. The apartment was quiet around them. Emma down the hall, the street sounds low and distant, the October night doing what October nights in Connecticut did, which was settle into itself with the specific gravity of a season that knew it was almost over. Ryan set the coffee down and sat back at the table, and they talked about nothing important for a while. And it was good. Not grand, not the kind of thing that announced itself, just good. The ordinary kind. The kind that held. Winter came to Hartford the way it always did. Not dramatically, not all at once, but by degrees, the days shortening and the temperature dropping in small increments until one morning you looked out the window and the world had gone gray and permanent looking, and you understood that this was it. This was the season, and you'd better make your peace with it. Ryan noticed it on a Tuesday morning in late November when he started his car and the engine turned over slowly, reluctant, the way engines complained when the temperature had crossed a threshold they hadn't been consulted about. Emma was in the passenger seat in her new winter coat, navy blue, proper fit, her wrists not visible when she held her arms straight down, eating a granola bar and reading something on the school iPad, with the focused indifference of a child who had decided mornings were a logistical problem rather than an experience. He sat in the cold car waiting for the defroster to work and thought, without planning to, about the parking lot of the Gulf station 6 weeks ago. The rain, the layoff notice on the passenger seat, the specific quality of that particular $20, the last of something, the end of a buffer he'd been managing carefully for months, gone in a transaction that took less than 30 seconds, and that he'd been too tired and too empty to even fully register as significant in the moment. He hadn't been performing generosity that night. That was the thing he kept coming back to. He hadn't done it from strength or abundance or the comfortable position of someone who could afford to be charitable. He'd done it because a woman needed $11 and he had 20, and the math was that simple. And everything that followed, Victoria, the work, the company, the 11,000 families, the new job, the dinners, all of it, had followed from that simple, unremarkable arithmetic. He'd thought about this more than was probably useful. The randomness of it sat with him in ways he couldn't fully explain. Not the kind of randomness that felt cosmic or designed. He didn't believe in that kind. But the ordinary randomness of human proximity, of being in the same gas station at the same time, of the particular accident of geography and timing that put two strangers in the same fluorescent-lit space on a rainy evening in October. Life was full of those moments. Almost all of them went nowhere. Most people drove past each other on highways every day, existed in the same checkout lines, breathed the same recycled air in airport terminals, and left no trace of each other at all. The moments that became something were indistinguishable, at the time, from the moments that became nothing. That seemed important somehow, though Ryan was not entirely sure how to carry it. "Dad?" Emma said. "Yeah." The defroster's working. He looked at the windshield. It was clear. He'd been sitting in a warm, clear windshielded car for some amount of time. "Right," he said, and put it in reverse. The formal restructuring of Ryan's role at Hayes Capital was completed in early December, signed and filed with the state regulatory authorities that oversaw registered investment advisors. His title was co-CEO. His function was what Victoria had described: risk strategy, restructuring analysis, the external work that the company increasingly needed as its reputation for stability attracted clients who'd been through their own versions of what the retirement fund had nearly experienced. His hours were his own within the framework of what the work required, which was the distinction that mattered. He told almost no one about it. Mrs. Petrakis found out because she found out about everything, through a process of observation and inference that Ryan had long since stopped trying to understand. She acknowledged the news with the restraint of someone who had already known it. "This is good," she said on a Wednesday morning, handing him a container of food he hadn't asked for. "Emma's school has a winter concert in 2 weeks. Don't forget." "I won't forget." "I'll remind you," she said. His first significant project in the new role arrived in the second week of December. A small manufacturing pension fund in Massachusetts that had retained Hayes Capital for a strategic review after their existing administrator had been bought out in an acquisition that left their governance structure in ambiguity. It was not a crisis situation. It was the kind of careful preventive work that Ryan was better at than the emergency work, if he was being honest. Because emergencies required a specific kind of improvisation under pressure that he could do, but that cost him more than it probably should. He spent 3 days reviewing the fund's structure and presented Victoria with a 12-page assessment that she read in one sitting and sent back with 4 questions, all of them good. He answered them. They reached agreement. The client was notified. It was, in the fundamental sense, just work. Not heroic, not urgent, not freighted with the weight of 11,000 people's savings on the line. Just the competent, careful work of someone who understood a specific kind of problem and knew how to address it. Ryan found he had missed it. Not in the aching way he'd sometimes feared he would, not with the implication that he'd sacrificed something irreplaceable when he stepped back from that world. More in the way you missed a language you'd grown up speaking and stopped using, and discovered, when you started again, that it came back easier than you'd expected and felt. In your mouth, like something that belonged there. He talked to Victoria about this one evening in her office, later than either of them typically stayed, the building mostly emptied out around them and the December dark pressing against the windows. It was the kind of conversation that happened in the particular honesty of the end of a day, when the professional armor had mostly come off, and the things that were actually on your mind had less competition from the things that were merely urgent. "I thought coming back would feel like a retreat," he said. "Like I was admitting something I didn't want to admit." Victoria looked at him from across the desk. "Admitting what?" "That I'd been running from something." He paused. "That choosing Emma was partly a way of not having to show up in rooms like this one and risk being a version of myself I didn't trust." She was quiet for a moment. "Was it?" "Partly," he said. He'd thought about this enough to be honest about it without needing to perform the honesty. Mostly, it was exactly what it looked like. She needed a parent who was present. I was the one left. I made the choice. He paused. But there was a smaller piece that was about me not wanting to find out what I was worth without the context I'd built around myself. Without Sophie. Victoria looked at him steadily. The name sat in the air between them. Ryan didn't use it often, and when he did, it had a specific gravity. "And now?" Victoria asked. Ryan looked at the window, the Hartford skyline, modest and familiar, the river somewhere beyond it moving in the dark. "Now I think I know what I'm worth without that context, which is different from what I thought I was worth, and not as bad." Victoria didn't respond immediately. She had a quality he'd come to value. The willingness to let things land before speaking, to not immediately fill the space after something difficult with something easier. She sat with what he'd said for a moment, and he sat with having said it, and the office was quiet around them. "Sophie would have liked knowing that," Victoria said finally. It was a strange thing to say, and it was the right thing to say. And Ryan looked at Victoria Hayes in the winter dark office and felt the particular gratitude of a person who has been understood accurately and unexpectedly. "Yeah," he said quietly. She would have won. The winter concert at Emma's school was on a Thursday evening in the second week of December. Emma was in the fourth grade choir, which performed 3 songs with the enthusiastic imprecision of 32 children who had rehearsed adequately and were now experiencing the specific chaos of a live audience. Emma stood in the second row and sang with the focused commitment of someone determined to get every word right, which Ryan had known she would because she approached everything that way. Ryan sat in the school auditorium between Mrs. Petrakis, who had come unbidden and was wearing her good coat, and Victoria, who had come because Ryan had mentioned it once, in passing. And she'd said what time with a directness that had closed the possibility of him suggesting she didn't need to bother. Mrs. Petrakis had acknowledged Victoria's presence with a brief nod that communicated, without ambiguity, that she had expected her to be there. The choir sang about winter and the turning of seasons and something about rivers. And Emma's face through all 3 songs was the face of someone doing exactly what they'd set out to do, entirely present, entirely herself. Ryan watched her and felt the thing he always felt watching Emma do things, that specific, uncomfortable love of a parent, the kind that was inseparable from vulnerability, from the knowledge that this person existed in a world that was not consistently gentle, and that your ability to protect her from it was finite and diminishing by design. He felt this sitting in a school auditorium between an elderly Greek woman who fed him things he hadn't asked for and a woman who had entered his life through a declined credit card in a gas station and was now, in ways that were still finding their shape, a part of the specific architecture of his days. He thought about Sophie. He did this less than he used to. Not because he'd forgotten her, not because the loss had resolved into something clean, but because grief had a way, given enough time and enough living, of changing its form without disappearing. It didn't become smaller, exactly. It became something you carried differently, less in your hands, more somewhere else, somewhere that hurt less and remembered just as clearly. Sophie would have been in this auditorium. That was the thought, the one that arrived occasionally and without warning, usually in the specific happiness of moments that were exactly the kind she'd have been present for. She would have been in the third row, probably, slightly closer than was strictly necessary, and she would have been crying before the first song finished because she cried at everything Emma did, which had embarrassed Emma as a toddler and would have embarrassed her now, and would have been exactly right. Ryan did not cry. He sat in his folding chair and watched his daughter sing and let the missing be what it was, real and present, and not the enemy of anything else that was also real and present. After the concert, Emma found them in the lobby, still in her choir robe, carrying the specific energy of someone who has done a thing, and done it well, and would like that acknowledged. "I was on pitch the whole time," she announced. "You were," Ryan said. "Except the third song." "The third song was fine. The high note was slightly under." She was matter-of-fact about it. "I know. I could hear it." Mrs. Petrakis handed her a small container of pastry that she had, apparently, been carrying in her coat pocket. Emma received this as entirely normal. Victoria said, "You sounded great. I meant that, not the polite version." Emma looked at her. "How do you know the difference?" "The polite version says great job and changes the subject. I told you specifically that you were on pitch. That's different." Emma considered this with the genuine non-performative assessment she applied to arguments she hadn't yet decided about. Then she nodded. "Fair." They walked out into the December cold. The 4 of them, which was a configuration that Ryan registered without naming, The way you registered things that had become ordinary before you'd gotten around to officially noticing them. Emma walked between Ryan and Victoria and talked about the third song's high note with the analytical persistence of someone working through a problem they intended to solve before the next performance. And Mrs. Petrakis walked beside Ryan and said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. In the parking lot, Mrs. Petrakis said goodnight with the brevity of someone who had done what she came to do, kissed Emma on the head, nodded at Victoria with what Ryan was fairly certain was approval, the specific, restrained approval of someone who gave it rarely and meant it when they did, and went to her car. Emma said she was cold and got in Ryan's car to wait. Ryan and Victoria stood in the parking lot. The December air was the kind of cold that clarified things, cut through whatever softening the afternoon's warmth had provided, and left the world precise and unambiguous. Victoria had her coat collar up and her hands in her pockets, and she was looking at him with an expression that was neither the professional face nor the private face, but something that existed between them, something that had been developing in the space between professional and private for several weeks. "I keep not saying something," Victoria said. Ryan looked at her. "I know. It's not—" She stopped. "I'm usually better at saying things directly." "You're excellent at saying things directly in a professional context," Ryan said. "This is a different context." She looked at him. "Yes, it is." A pause. "I don't want to say it wrong and have it change what we've built. The work, She made a small gesture that was apparently meant to encompass a significant amount of recent history. "It won't," Ryan said. "You don't know that." "I know you," he said, "well enough to know that's not how this works with you." Victoria was quiet for a moment. The parking lot was emptying around them, families dispersing into cars, the small noise of the evening wrapping up. Emma was visible through the car window, looking at something on the school iPad, not watching them, which was either coincidence or tactical, and with Emma it was impossible to be certain which. "I've been thinking about the gas station," Victoria said. Ryan waited. "About what would have happened if I'd had the right card that night, if my wallet hadn't been stolen, if the timing had been different by 20 minutes. She looked at the parking lot lights, the cold vapor of her breath in the air. "I'd have gotten my charger and my water and driven away and never known your name." "Yes," Ryan said. "That bothers me more than it should, given that it didn't happen." Ryan looked at her. "It bothers me too." Victoria looked back at him, and the thing that had been living in the space between professional and private for 6 weeks came fully into the open between them, in a parking lot outside an elementary school in Hartford in December, without ceremony and without performance, which was the only way it could have happened honestly. "I'd like to figure out what this is," she said. "Whatever this is, not immediately, not in a way that puts pressure on Emma or the work or anything else we've built, but I'd like to stop pretending I don't know that something is here." Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his car where Emma was still on the iPad, the image of someone minding their own business with excessive thoroughness. "She knows," he said. Victoria almost smiled. "I assumed." "She has opinions." "I assumed that too." The almost smile became more definite. "What are her opinions?" "Favorable," Ryan said, conditionally. "She has standards." "So I've gathered." Victoria looked at him. "And you? What are your conditions?" Ryan thought about this, not performatively, just actually, the way the question deserved. He thought about the kitchen table, and the legal pads and the storage unit, and the trust documents and the school concerts and the toast at midnight, and all the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of proximity, all the ways two people could come to know each other through the work of shared difficulty before they'd gotten around to the easier knowledge. "No conditions," he said. "I just want to do this right, at the right speed." "That's all I want," Victoria said. "Then we're fine." She looked at him. "Yeah? Yeah?" She nodded. That same minimal nod, the one he'd learned to read as the version of a thing that didn't need more elaboration, that was complete in itself. Then she said goodnight and got in her car, and Ryan got in his, and Emma looked up from the iPad with the expression of someone who had been extremely busy not watching something. "How did that go?" Emma said. Ryan looked at his daughter. "Mind your business," he said. Emma smiled in the way that meant she already knew. The new year arrived with the specific blank slate quality that New Year's carried whether you asked them to or not.
And Ryan moved through January with the feeling of someone who had found their footing after a long stretch of uncertain ground. Not settled in the way of someone who had stopped moving, more the settled feeling of a person who had found the right ground to be moving on. The work at Hayes Capital had deepened into something with genuine scope. The Massachusetts fund client had referred 2 additional clients through their network, and by February, Ryan had a specific function within the company that was distinct from Victoria's and complementary in ways that the initial conversation had only gestured at. They had disagreements, real ones, not performed for the sake of appearing balanced. Ryan thought Victoria moved too fast on client communications sometimes, sending final language before all the structural questions were resolved, creating commitments that then constrained the analytical work. Victoria thought Ryan waited too long on decisions that didn't require the level of certainty he was seeking, that his instinct for patience was sometimes excessive and cost them momentum. Both of them were partially right, which was the most honest way to characterize it. They'd had the version of this conversation that was vaguely professional twice, and then Ryan had said, on a Thursday afternoon in February, that they should just say the actual thing, and they'd had the actual version, which was direct and somewhat uncomfortable, and ended with both of them making specific adjustments and the work improving measurably afterward. Victoria had looked at him after that conversation and said, "I'm glad you said that." "You would have gotten there," Ryan said. "Probably not that directly. You would have gotten there eventually." "Maybe." She looked at him. "You're better at this than I am." "At what?" "Saying the uncomfortable thing without making it feel like an attack." Ryan thought about this. "Sophie taught me that," he said. "She had a very low tolerance for things that needed to be said not being said. She'd rather have the difficult conversation immediately than carry it for 3 days and have it be worse." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "She was someone most people liked," Ryan said. "She was also someone who would have had significant opinions about you." "Good opinions or bad opinions?" "Both. She'd have respected you completely and given you a hard time about working too much." He paused. "She gave me a hard time about working too much." Victoria looked at the desk. "I can accept that." The last legal remnant of the Meridian situation was resolved in early March, when their legal team formally withdrew from the final pending motion, and Patricia Donnell sent an email to the full executive committee with the subject line, "It's done. No body text, just the subject line." Ryan was in his car in Emma's school pickup line when he got the email, and he read it, and then sat in the line waiting his turn, and felt the completeness of the thing settle across him like a weight that had been waiting to come off for months. 11,000 people were in the same positions they'd been in before any of this started, retired or approaching retirement, planning around numbers that were still intact, making small daily decisions against the backdrop of a future that still existed the way they'd built it. They didn't know his name. Most of them would never know what had almost happened. That was fine. That was in fact the correct outcome. The best version of protection being the kind that was invisible because it worked. The kind that left people free to live their lives without needing to know how close the margin had been. Ryan thought about this sometimes, not with any need for recognition, but with the particular satisfaction of someone who understood the nature of the thing they'd done. He'd been asked once by a journalist who was doing a piece on the Meridian acquisition attempt, a story that was coming out with the edges carefully managed by Patricia and Victoria's communications team, whether he'd like to be quoted. He'd said no. Victoria had asked him about that afterward. "You could have been named," she said. "It would have been accurate." "I know," Ryan said. "You don't want the credit?" He'd thought about how to say it. "The credit isn't what I came back for," he said. "I came back because 11,000 people I'll never meet needed something done that I could do. The name attached to it doesn't change what it was." Victoria had looked at him for a long moment. "My father would have said exactly that. You told me that before." "I know, I keep meaning it more." Emma turned 9 in April, and Ryan made pancakes. The good ones, with the real butter and the batter he made from scratch rather than the box, which he only did on mornings that required it. Emma came to the table in her pajamas and the specific bedhead of someone who had slept deeply and well, and there were candles in the pancakes because they didn't have a cake yet, which was a tradition they'd started when Emma was 4, and had continued because Emma had decided it was a tradition and Ryan hadn't found a reason to disagree. Victoria arrived at 9:30 with a box from the Good Bakery and the careful expression of someone who had chosen a birthday gift for a 9-year-old with more consideration than she was going to admit to.
Emma opened it and found a set of astronomy books. Not children's books, actual reference texts with proper photography, the kind written for people who wanted to understand rather than be charmed. And her face did the thing it did when she received something that was exactly right, which was that she didn't perform delight. She just became it. "How did you know?" Emma said. "You talked about the solar system project," Victoria said. "The way you talked about it." Emma looked at her. "Most adults get me stuff about horses because I mentioned horses once in 3rd grade. I listened to what you said rather than the most memorable thing you said." Emma absorbed this. Then she said with the seriousness of someone making a meaningful evaluation, "That's actually rare." "I know," Victoria said. "It shouldn't be." Ryan stood at the kitchen counter watching his daughter and Victoria at the birthday table and thought about the specific strangeness of a life, how it moved in directions you didn't anticipate, how the things that broke you rebuilt themselves into shapes you wouldn't have chosen but couldn't imagine doing without. Sophie was in the room in the way she was always in the room on Emma's birthdays, not as absence exactly, more as presence in a different register, the permanent fact of someone who had been there for the beginning and was written into everything that followed. He thought Sophie would have liked this morning. The pancakes, the books, the particular clear-eyed way Victoria had listened to what Emma actually said rather than what was convenient to hear. She would have given Victoria a hard time about something, probably the working too much, and Victoria would have given it back better than expected, and they would have found each other in the way that people found each other when they were honest. He thought this without sadness, or with a kind of sadness that had been incorporated so fully into everything else that it wasn't distinguishable from the rest of life anymore. Present, but not dominant. Real, but not defining. Emma was 9 years old and reading the index of an astronomy book at the breakfast table on her birthday, asking questions that the index was generating in her rather than answering, her voice carrying the specific momentum of a mind that had found a new subject and was already running with it. "Did you know there are more stars in the observable universe than grains of sand on every beach on Earth?" Emma said. "I did," Victoria said. "Does it make you feel small?" Victoria considered this. "It makes me feel like scale is stranger than we usually think about." Emma nodded. "That's what I think too." She looked at Ryan. "What do you think?" Ryan looked at his daughter, at the books, at Victoria across the table, at the ordinary Sunday morning kitchen that contained, right now, everything that mattered. "I think," he said, "that the scale of everything else doesn't change the scale of this." Emma looked at him. "That's either very deep or you just deflected the question." "Both things," Victoria said, and Emma laughed and Ryan laughed, and the kitchen held all of it. The laughter, and the morning, and the people, and the complicated fact of what they were to each other, which was still finding its exact form, and would be for some time, which was fine. That was how the real things went. They found their form slowly, with effort, with occasional friction and occasional grace and the daily accumulation of showing up. Mrs. Petrakis arrived at 10 with more food and the air of someone executing a plan she had developed independently. She assessed the scene, the books, the bakery box, the three of them at the table, and nodded once with the minimal satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. "Happy birthday," she said to Emma. "You already texted me," Emma said. "Now I'm saying it." She put the food on the counter and looked at Ryan. "You're eating enough." "I am. This is an observation," she said. She looked at Victoria. "You should come to dinner on Sunday. He cooks Sunday dinners. They're good." "Mrs. Petrakis," Ryan said. "I'm not advising," she said. She looked at Victoria expectantly. Victoria looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at the ceiling. "Sunday," Emma said. "She should come Sunday." Ryan looked at his daughter. Emma looked back with the expression of someone who was 8 years old yesterday and 9 today, and felt the difference as a kind of authority. "Sunday," Ryan said. Victoria looked at him. "I'll be there." That was that. The morning moved on the way mornings did, Emma deep in her astronomy books, Mrs. Petrakis rearranging Ryan's kitchen with the confidence of someone who had earned that right through years of showing up, and Ryan at the counter making more coffee because there were more people to make it for, which was not the worst problem a person could have. He thought, standing at the counter, about the layoff notice, about the rain and the gas station and the $20, about the specific night that had started all of this. Not with a plan, not with intention, not with any awareness that something was beginning. Just a man in a gas station with his last $20 and no particular reason to do what he did except that someone needed it, and it was possible. He'd never told Victoria what he'd been calculating in the car before he went in. The heating oil versus groceries math. The way he'd sat in the parking lot running numbers that kept coming out wrong. She knew about the $20, knew what he'd given up, but she didn't know the specific context of the calculation, the particular exhaustion of that night, how empty it had felt. He might tell her someday. There was time. That was the thing he kept coming back to, the thing that felt most different from the October version of himself. There was time now, real time, the kind that belonged to someone who had a place to be and people to be there with. He poured the coffee and carried it to the table and sat down with the people in his kitchen and his 9-year-old daughter's birthday morning, and the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable weight of a life that had found, without his full permission or planning, a new shape. Not a perfect shape, not a resolved shape. There were things still in motion, still finding their arrangement, still requiring the daily work of two people who were honest enough to know that the work didn't stop. There were hard days ahead, and disagreements not yet had, and moments that wouldn't be easy. But the shape was real. It was his. It had been built from the strangest materials, a gas station and a storage unit, and 73 pages of legal documentation, and a solar system project, and a dead man's handwriting, and a woman at a window table eating eggs at 7 in the morning. And it held. That was enough. In the real accounting of a life, that was more than enough. Emma looked up from her astronomy book. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. This book says some stars have already burned out, but we can still see their light because of how far away they are." "That's right," Ryan said. Emma thought about this for a moment, turning it over in the particular way she turned things over when they meant something she hadn't finished understanding yet. "So the light is still real," she said, "even if the thing that made it is gone." Ryan looked at his daughter. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." Emma nodded once, satisfied, and went back to reading. Victoria looked at Ryan across the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked back, and they held that for a moment. The quiet understanding between two people who had each lost something irreplaceable and had kept going anyway, and had found, in the keeping going, each other. Outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings did, trying to be spring, not quite managing, the sky somewhere between the gray of winter and the clarity of something better. In a few weeks it would get there. The trees on Millwood Avenue would come back, the way they did every year without being asked, without acknowledging that they'd ever been gone. Ryan drank his coffee. The light came through the kitchen window the way it always did.